Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Field of Death. The drive through Idaho had always felt like a passage through the forgotten corners of the world. Open fields stretched endlessly on either side of the road, interrupted only by the occasional cluster of trees or a distant barn. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound, and it made everything else feel strangely quiet, almost too quiet. It was late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind a veil of clouds, casting long shadows that stretched over the flat landscape. I had been on the road for hours, and the thought of reaching my next destination, wherever that was, didn't seem to matter much. I wasn't in any rush. The isolation of the area had a way of lulling you into a deep sense of nothingness, where the world outside felt like a distant memory. And then, as I rounded a bend in the road, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I looked again, I saw them, figures standing in the middle of a vast field, lined up in a row. The figures were tall and hunched, draped in what appeared to be tattered clothes. Their faces, if they had faces, were hidden in shadow, but the shapes were unmistakable. They were scarecrows. Except they weren't quite like any scarecrows I had ever seen before. These figures were too lifelike, too still. In fact, they seemed to be waiting, as if they had been placed there deliberately, just for me to see. The wind was light, barely enough to move the grass at my feet, yet the figures didn't budge, not even a little. They stood perfectly still, their arms stretched out, frozen in a grotesque imitation of life. I slowed the car, squinting at them through the windshield. There was something off about it, something that didn't sit right with me. I knew it was irrational, but the way they stood in that endless expanse, perfectly placed in the field like they were part of the landscape itself, gave me a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. They were just scarecrows. A farmer's attempt to keep the birds away, probably. There was nothing unusual about that. But the longer I stared, the harder it became to believe my own reasoning. The light was fading, and shadows began to creep across the ground, casting the figures in even darker silhouettes. As I drove past the field, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. The scarecrows hadn't moved, but somehow it felt as though they were watching me. The sensation crawled under my skin, making my heart beat faster. I shook my head. It was just the isolation playing tricks on me, I thought. The road stretched out in front of me like a long tunnel, and the only sound was the constant hum of the engine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural, was waiting out there in that field. I couldn't ignore the pull. It was irrational, but something deep inside me urged me to turn the car around and go back. The road was empty, the silence suffocating, and I had nothing better to do. What harm could there be in stopping for a moment? Maybe I could get a better look, figure out what was so unsettling about the scarecrows. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. With a sigh, I pulled the car over to the side of the road. The gravel crunched under the tires as I parked, and I killed the engine. The silence that followed felt almost oppressive, as if the world had grown suddenly heavier. I stared out the window at the field again. The scarecrows were still there, unmoving, standing like silent sentinels under the fading light. Their tattered clothes fluttered faintly in the wind, but the figures themselves remained eerily still. I watched them for a long moment, studying their posture, the way they stood so perfectly upright, their limbs arranged at precise angles. There was a mechanical quality to it, too deliberate to be natural. But the wind was light, and the field was vast. Maybe it was just the oddness of the place, the emptiness, the flatness of the land, the way the sun was setting and casting strange shadows. I told myself that was all it was. I was just tired from the drive. My brain was picking up on things that weren't there, exaggerating simple shapes, turning shadows into figures. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It's just a bunch of scarecrows, I muttered to myself. That's all they are. They've probably been standing there for years. But then a strange feeling crept over me, a sensation I couldn't quite put into words. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like I was being watched. The kind of feeling you get when you think someone's staring at you, even though you can't see them. I shifted in my seat, feeling my pulse quicken, but I pushed the thought away. This was just paranoia. Nothing more. I opened the car door, stepping out into the cool air. The field stretched out before me, the scarecrows like dark silhouettes against the dimming sky. They didn't seem quite as lifeless now. I walked slowly toward the edge of the field, trying to keep my footsteps steady. The grass was tall here, swaying slightly in the breeze, and I had to push through it as I made my way closer to the scarecrows. I tried to observe them more closely, looking for any signs of movement. Maybe there was a reason for my unease. Maybe they had been placed there in such a way that the light played tricks on my eyes. But as I approached, nothing changed. They were still. Silent. A part of the landscape. Just some old scarecrows, I repeated, more to myself than to anyone else. Nothing more. I glanced at the sun, sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field. The light was soft now, the colors of the world fading into the grayish blue of twilight. I felt my anxiety start to settle, the tension in my shoulders loosening. There was nothing wrong here. It was just my imagination. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The scarecrows stood stoically, unmoving, and I realized it was absurd to feel afraid of them. I had no reason to. It was just a field. Just the end of a long drive. The world was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. But quiet didn't mean danger. As I turned to head back to the car, I gave the scarecrows one last glance. This time, I was certain I saw something shift in my peripheral vision. A slight movement. Maybe one of the figures had turned its head just a little, but I couldn't be sure. I blinked, looking more closely. No. They were still. Of course, they were. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I quickly dismissed it as the evening air. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath. I turned and walked briskly back to my car, eager to leave the field behind. It was just my nerves. The strange, lonely expanse of the land had played with my mind. Nothing more. But as I pulled away, my eyes couldn't resist one last look in the rearview mirror. The scarecrows were still standing where they had been before. But for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw one of them shift slightly, like it was tilting its head toward me. I shook my head again. It was nothing. It was all in my mind. But the unease lingered, following me down the empty road. The road ahead stretched out, empty and endless. I tried to focus on the white lines in the asphalt, to clear my mind of the strange feeling that had settled over me. The hum of the engine was a steady background to the thoughts racing through my head. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, my mind kept drifting back to the field. The scarecrows. I had convinced myself that I was being foolish. I had no reason to be afraid of a bunch of old scarecrows standing in a field. They were just part of the landscape, an odd but harmless sight in an area full of oddities. But something about them, something about the way they had stood so unnaturally still, like they were waiting for something, kept gnawing at me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The field was now behind me, and the scarecrows were still there, standing tall and unmoving against the fading light. But as I watched, my breath caught in my throat. One of the figures moved. It wasn't much at first. Just a subtle shift. A slight tilt of its head, as though it had heard something, or maybe had been listening for a long time. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was unmistakable. The scarecrow's head turned just enough to catch the last rays of sunlight. A wave of panic washed over me, sudden and overwhelming. My hands tightened on the wheel, my heart thudding in my chest as I accelerated instinctively, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was happening back there. My mind raced with the possibility that I hadn't imagined it, that the scarecrow had actually moved, had somehow shifted its position as I'd looked away. I couldn't focus on the road fast enough, my thoughts tangling together in a frantic mess of fear. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my pulse hammering in my ears. The scarecrows were still standing in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that one of them was looking directly at me now. I could almost feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on me through the glass. I had to get out of there. Fast. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine roaring as the landscape blurred past me. The road ahead seemed endless, but I wasn't sure if it mattered. My eyes kept darting back to the rearview mirror, but I couldn't bring myself to look for long. What if one of them was following me? What if they could move? The thought sounded ridiculous, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew that something wasn't right. The stillness of the field, the unnatural quiet of the place, the way the scarecrows had seemed to watch me, everything about it felt wrong. I was losing my grip on reality, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. I had to focus, had to push the panic away. The road was empty. The field was behind me. There was nothing to be afraid of. But as the minutes passed and I drove deeper into the night, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I glanced once more at the rearview mirror, the image of the scarecrows still haunting me. There was nothing to see, just the fading light of the evening sky and the dark stretch of road behind me. I forced myself to look away, but my heart was still pounding, my thoughts still scrambled. As the miles ticked by, I tried to rationalize the sensation that lingered in the air. Maybe I'd seen something that wasn't there, maybe it had just been the angle of the sun, the way the shadows had played tricks on my mind. It was probably nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world behind me, that quiet, empty field, was somehow still waiting for me to return. The farther I drove, the more the tension twisted inside me. The miles passed in a blur, but it didn't matter. The silence of the road, the emptiness of the landscape, only seemed to amplify the noise in my head. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, and with every second, the unease I tried to suppress only seemed to grow. I tried to focus on the road, to clear my mind, but the images from the field, those lifeless figures, the way one of them had shifted, the terrible suspicion that it was no longer a scarecrow at all, refused to leave me. I could still feel the weight of their presence, as if the field itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with the pounding of my heart. Just a trick of the light, I muttered under my breath. The words felt hollow, like I was trying to convince myself more than anything else. Just a trick of the light. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, as though the pressure could steady my racing thoughts. The world outside the car was dark now, the last remnants of twilight fading into the kind of blackness that only comes with isolation. The road ahead stretched into an endless void, and the only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt. I was utterly alone. Still, the silence, it felt unnatural. Heavy. Like the entire world had been drained of sound, leaving nothing but the eerie stillness of the night. I could hear the slight creaking of the car's interior, the faintest rustle of fabric as I shifted in my seat. But there was nothing else. No distant sounds of animals or wind in the trees. Just the oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I thought about turning on the radio, anything to break the silence, but I didn't. Part of me knew it wouldn't help. The radio would just remind me of the emptiness, the way every station seemed to come in faint and distorted in this part of the country. It would only make the quiet feel worse. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. I told myself it was just the paranoia setting in, that the field and the scarecrows were far behind me now. But each time I looked back, I half expected to see the figures, standing tall, unmoving, waiting. The idea was preposterous, of course. I had driven miles since passing that field. I was long past it. And yet, the fear I had felt earlier, that nagging sense of being watched, had only deepened. It wasn't just that I had seen something move, it was the silence, the way everything had been so perfectly still. The more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. What if those figures weren't just scarecrows at all? What if they were something else? Something that waited for the world to look away before they shifted, before they came alive? I shook my head violently, trying to dispel the thought. Stop it. There's nothing there. The logical part of me told me it was just fear taking hold, nothing more. A trick of the light. An overactive imagination. But even as I repeated the words to myself, they didn't feel convincing. There was something about that field, that stillness, that hadn't felt right. Something waiting. I drove on, faster now, trying to outrun the creeping sense of dread that followed me. But no matter how fast I went, the silence, the oppressive quiet of the night, kept closing in. It's nothing, I told myself again, but it didn't help. The fear gnawed at me. The idea that I might have seen something, or worse, that I might not have seen enough, kept bubbling up inside me like a dark stain spreading across the edges of my thoughts. The further I went, the more I questioned myself. Had it really been a trick of the light? Had I imagined the shift of one of those figures? Or was there something more to it? I pressed my foot harder on the gas, trying to put as much distance between myself and the field as possible, but even as the miles ticked by, I couldn't escape the feeling that the night was closing in on me. I was alone, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following, just outside my reach. And the silence had become suffocating. The miles passed without incident, but the longer I drove, the heavier the air seemed to grow. The darkness outside pressed in, thick and suffocating. I kept my hands firmly on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but the unsettling thoughts wouldn't stop creeping into my mind. It wasn't the field that haunted me now, it was the feeling that something was still there, something that was never truly left behind. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. The time seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute dragging on longer than the last. But it wasn't the clock I was focused on. It was the weight in my chest, the unease that gnawed at my insides, a low hum of dread that I couldn't shake, no matter how fast I drove. I had left the field behind, right? I had passed it. There was no reason to look back. But every fiber of my being screamed at me to check, to make sure that I hadn't missed something, that those figures hadn't moved again, or worse, followed me. It's all in your head, I told myself, over and over. It's just the silence. It's just the road playing tricks on you. But the further I went, the more that rational thought slipped away. I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened, that I had just been tired, maybe a little too paranoid after too many hours on the road. But the more I tried to rationalize, the less it made sense. The field had been too still, too quiet. The scarecrows had stood there like they were waiting for something. No, like they were waiting for me. And that thought, just the thought, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the field that felt wrong, it was the whole atmosphere, the eerie quiet that seemed to be a part of the land itself. Everything around me felt too silent, as if the world was holding its breath. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but the shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch longer with every mile. The open space around me felt vast and unwelcoming, like there was nothing else for miles. The kind of nothing that shouldn't exist in the real world. I tried to focus on the road, to just get through the night, but every time I looked away from the headlights, I thought I saw something moving at the edge of my vision, just beyond the trees or in the reflection of the side mirror. A fleeting shadow. A dark shape. But when I turned to look, it was always gone. It was like I was being followed, and I couldn't figure out from where. Every part of me was on edge, my nerves raw and stretched thin. I fought the urge to turn around, to race back to the field and check again. What would I even be looking for? It was just a bunch of scarecrows. They couldn't have— No, stop it, I ordered myself. They're just scarecrows. Nothing else. But the unease wouldn't let go. The silence around me felt unnatural now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet that comes with being alone on a dark road. It was a deeper, more oppressive quiet, the kind that made your own breathing sound too loud, too intrusive. The kind that made you question whether you were really as alone as you thought you were. My mind was spinning, and the darkness outside seemed to amplify every doubt, every fleeting fear. Was I just imagining things? Had I really seen one of them move? What if something else had been there, something I couldn't see? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of anxiety settling over me. It didn't help. It just made it worse. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the thick, choking sense of dread that hadn't left me since I passed the field. Even though the scarecrows were miles behind me, I could still feel them in my gut, a gnawing, invisible presence. The worst part? I didn't know why. The headlights flashed off a distant shape in the road, just a shadow, a tree stump, something indistinct, but my heart skipped a beat. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but I couldn't help it. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, instinctively. And there, just for a moment, I thought I saw something. A shape. No, a figure. A silhouette standing in the middle of the road, just outside the beam of my headlights. But as I blinked, it was gone. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the car surging forward, my pulse racing with the speed. Focus, I told myself, forcing my grip tighter on the wheel. But the growing dread didn't subside. It only seemed to grow stronger, feeding off my fear, feeding off the isolation of the road around me. I wasn't just being paranoid. Something was wrong. Something was out there. But as I sped into the night, I couldn't help but wonder, was I just running from it, or was it running with me? Days passed, but the unease never fully left me. The field, the scarecrows, the way they had moved, each memory seemed to return in waves, crashing over me at the most unexpected moments. I tried to bury it, tried to push it aside as I continued my travels through Idaho, but no matter how far I drove, how many towns I passed, the thought of that field haunted me. It lingered, settling in the back of my mind like a persistent itch I couldn't reach. I had convinced myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, just my imagination running wild after hours on the road. Scarecrows don't move. They don't. That's what I kept telling myself, trying to talk myself out of it. But the images wouldn't fade. And every time I tried to forget about them, they returned with sharper clarity. It was an ordinary morning when the thought first struck me, what if I was wrong? What if it hadn't been a trick of the light at all? What if something did move in that field? What if I was missing something? I had to go back. I had to see for myself. I couldn't keep living with the nagging feeling that I had just turned tail without finding out the truth. I had been telling myself that I was fine, that nothing had happened. But the longer I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. I needed answers, something concrete to reassure myself, to finally settle the unease that had taken root in my gut. So, I turned the car around. The decision came easily enough in the moment. I didn't even question it. I just needed to go back. To see that field again. To prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. That it had all been a trick, just a weird moment of fear and exhaustion. The sooner I could prove it to myself, the sooner I could put it all behind me. The drive back felt different. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me with each mile. There was a strange sense of inevitability in the air, like I was heading towards something I couldn't fully comprehend yet. I tried to ignore the feeling, tried to focus on the road ahead. The sun was higher now, burning off the early morning fog, but even the warmth of the day didn't seem to shake the cold that had crept into my chest. The landscape around me felt too familiar, too ordinary. The same trees, the same scattered farms, the same rolling hills that I had passed days ago. But now, they felt wrong. Empty. Hollow. It was as though the world around me was waiting for something, holding its breath in anticipation. When I reached the spot, I slowed down, keeping my eyes fixed on the horizon. The field was ahead, but it seemed smaller now, less imposing. Maybe it was because I knew what to expect. Or maybe it was the fact that the sun was fully up, casting the world in its usual harsh light. I could almost laugh at myself for ever having been so scared. The scarecrows were still there. At least, they looked like scarecrows. They stood as motionless as before, positioned in their usual spots across the field, the ragged clothes blowing slightly in the breeze. They were just scarecrows. I could see that now. There was nothing unusual about them. No strange movement, no shifting of their positions. Just an ordinary field, an ordinary collection of old figures meant to ward off birds. See? I told myself, trying to calm the unease still prickling at the back of my neck. It was nothing. Just a figment of your imagination. But as I slowed to a stop at the side of the road, my eyes lingered on the field a little longer than they should have. The air felt heavier now, as though the space between me and the scarecrows had grown somehow. My heart beat faster, my breath catching in my throat. There was something off. Something I couldn't place, but it lingered in the silence of the space between us. I turned the car off and opened the door, stepping out onto the gravel with a sharp crunch underfoot. The breeze rustled the dry grass around me, but it didn't feel as peaceful as it should. It felt unnatural, like the world itself was watching, waiting. I took a hesitant step forward, the unease still there, still crawling beneath my skin. But I was determined to prove to myself that there was nothing more to fear. Nothing more than my overactive imagination. I walked toward the edge of the field, my eyes fixed on the figures, trying to make sense of the growing discomfort inside me. My gaze shifted between the scarecrows, each one frozen in place, their wide, lifeless eyes staring blankly at nothing. But then, I swear I saw one of them twitch. Just the slightest motion, so small that it could have been a trick of the wind. But it wasn't. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, my blood going cold. There was no wind here. Not enough to make them move like that. The stillness that had felt so ordinary before now seemed terrifying. I stood there, staring at the scarecrow, my legs rooted to the ground. My mind raced, trying to reason it away. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I was not alone here. I stood at the edge of the field, my breath shallow, my body tense. The scarecrows were exactly where they had been before, tall, still, unmoving figures in the morning light. The same tattered clothes fluttered gently in the wind, their limbs positioned as if they had been frozen mid-motion for years. There was nothing different about them. Nothing to suggest that anything had changed since I last saw them. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping into my bones, reminding myself that these were just scarecrows. In the daylight, with the world around me bathed in harsh sunlight, there was no reason to be afraid. The unease I had felt before should have been easily dismissed. But standing here again, the sensation of something being wrong lingered in the air, like a cold draft I couldn't escape. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching against the gravel beneath me. The vast emptiness of the field stretched out before me, the tall, dry grasses swaying in the breeze. It all looked so normal, so untouched by anything unnatural. And yet, the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of something unseen pressing in on me. It was the silence again, the oppressive, suffocating quiet that seemed to cling to this place like a thick fog. I could hear my own breathing, but nothing else. The wind, the birds, the rustling of the grass, they were all absent. Just the eerie quiet of the field, stretching out like an endless void. Get a grip, I told myself. You're being ridiculous. There's nothing here. Just scarecrows. But even as I spoke the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that the field was watching me. The scarecrows stood like sentinels, their empty eyes fixed in different directions, yet it felt as though they were all aware of my presence. There was no reason for me to feel this way, no logical explanation for the sense of dread creeping over me. Still, my feet felt heavy, my movements hesitant, as if the land itself was trying to keep me from moving forward. I took another step, closer to the first figure, its worn straw arms hanging loosely by its sides. I could see the stitch marks along its ragged clothing, the way the fabric had been torn and faded by years of exposure to the elements. Nothing remarkable. But why did it feel so unsettling to be this close? Why did my chest tighten, and why was my skin crawling with the sense that I wasn't truly alone? I forced myself to look at the scarecrow's face. The pale, lifeless features were rudimentary at best, stitched together in an almost grotesque way. It was meant to look human, but there was something disturbingly wrong about it. Its button eyes were dull, flat, staring out into the distance with no expression, no life. Yet they seemed to see me. It was like they were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I pulled my gaze away quickly, and my heart began to race. Get it together, I thought. It's just a scarecrow. It's not alive. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my mind refused to let go of the feeling that I was being watched. My body screamed at me to leave, to turn around and drive away again. Yet something kept me rooted to the spot, a strange compulsion that was hard to ignore. I glanced around, scanning the other figures in the field. They all stood in their positions, motionless, unmoving. But somehow, despite the fact that they had not changed, the air around them felt different. Heavier. Like they were waiting for me to notice something more. Like they were waiting for me to realize something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the dry grass and carrying with it a faint rustling sound. It wasn't much, but in the silence of the field, it felt amplified, unnatural. I took a slow, cautious step back, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could almost hear my own heartbeat in the stillness. "It's nothing," I repeated to myself, but this time it was less convincing. "You're just on edge." But the more I stood there, the more that thought began to lose its hold. There was something wrong here. Something I couldn't see, but felt nonetheless. I turned my head quickly, scanning the perimeter of the field. There was no movement, nothing to indicate that anything had changed. Yet the air felt thick with anticipation, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt the presence of something else, something unseen, looming just beyond the corner of my vision. I had to leave. I should leave. But I couldn't. Not yet. My feet took another slow, reluctant step forward. The moment my foot touched the dry grass, I heard it. A faint sound, so subtle at first, I thought I might have imagined it. A rustling, like the soft whisper of fabric moving in the breeze. I paused, my breath catching for a split second, straining to listen. It came again, only this time it was clearer. A whisper, low and almost indecipherable. Too soft to make out, but unmistakable in its presence. The sound seemed to come from somewhere near the scarecrows, as though the very air around me was moving, shivering with an unseen life. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and a wave of coldness swept over me. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back in the car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But my feet felt glued to the ground. I couldn't move. The field, the figures, everything around me seemed to close in, pressing on me from all sides. "It's the wind," I told myself, forcing the thought into my mind. "It's just the wind, moving the straw and the fabric. You're imagining things." I tried to laugh it off. The sound of whispers, in a place like this? It didn't make sense. It wasn't even logical. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it gnawed at me. The whispering continued, low and persistent. It seemed to drift through the air like a shadow, never quite staying in one place, never quite solid enough to grasp. I squinted into the field, my eyes darting between the scarecrows. They were all standing motionless, as still as they had been when I first arrived. There was nothing to suggest that they were alive or that anything had changed. Yet the more I listened, the more it felt as though something was moving just out of sight. The figures themselves seemed to loom larger, their presence growing more pronounced, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, that they knew I was there. "It's nothing," I repeated, almost desperately. "It's just the wind playing tricks on you. You're fine." But my skin crawled with each passing second. The whispering didn't stop. It was growing louder now, like a soft murmur, a constant rustling just beyond the edge of my hearing. Was it the wind? Could the wind really sound like that? A low, breathy rustling, almost like voices? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Stop being paranoid. It's nothing. But that didn't make it go away. The longer I stood there, the more the whispers seemed to circle around me, coming from every direction, as though the entire field itself was alive with secret sounds. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in around me, broken only by these soft, disembodied noises that made no sense, but somehow felt like they belonged here. The wind shifted again, brushing past my face with a cool gust that carried the smell of earth and dry grass. I instinctively flinched, turning my head, but when I did, the whispering stopped abruptly, as though it had never existed at all. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag, and I took a quick step back, feeling my body tense in anticipation. The field seemed to exhale with me, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. It's nothing. I kept repeating it, but now it sounded less convincing. The paranoia was creeping in, the edges of my mind fraying, slipping into places I couldn't control. There it was again. The rustling. Faint. Barely there. A whisper. I turned my head sharply, my eyes scanning the field, but it was the same as before, empty, still, lifeless scarecrows standing in the tall, dry grass. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. But now, I wasn't sure. Was I hearing things? Was I imagining the soft, distant murmurs, the brush of movement in the air? Or had they always been there, hiding in the corners of my mind, waiting for me to finally listen? I glanced at the scarecrows again, but this time, something in my chest tightened. The breeze felt colder now. The shadows seemed longer. I tried to tell myself that the rustling was nothing more than a trick of the wind, just the grass swaying in the gusts, just the fabric of the scarecrows shifting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something was waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down. I forced myself to take another step forward, against the gnawing sense of unease. My eyes flicked to each figure, lingering a moment longer than I had before, my gaze searching, probing. But there was no sign of movement. No sign that anything had changed. Still, the whispers, the rustling, they were there, somewhere in the air. Just beyond the edge of my hearing. Unseen. Unheard by anyone else. I was sure of it now. Something was here. And it wasn't just the wind. My mind was racing as I stood in the field, the whispers fading but leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. The air was too still, too heavy, and with every passing second, my unease grew. I forced myself to focus on the scarecrows, these inanimate figures meant to ward off birds, nothing more. But the longer I stared at them, the more something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A slight shift, almost imperceptible. When I blinked and looked directly at the figure on my left, its position hadn't changed. Still standing tall, arms hanging loosely by its sides. But when I turned my attention back to the scarecrow on the far right, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't the position of its limbs, or the way its clothes hung, it was its presence. There was something unsettling about how it seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. Like it was watching me, like it had moved just slightly when I wasn't looking. I told myself it was just the wind again, nothing more than the play of shadows and light, the sway of straw in the breeze. But that didn't explain the cold lump of fear that lodged itself in my chest. The feeling of being watched, of being stalked by something invisible, became too intense to ignore. I glanced back over at the scarecrow by the far end of the field, trying to reassure myself that nothing had changed. But it had. This time, I saw it more clearly. The figure, its ragged face and button eyes staring into the distance, was no longer facing the same direction as before. It was now looking toward me. Not directly, but its head was tilted at an angle, as if it were tracking my every movement. No, that's impossible. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. The scarecrow hadn't moved. I was sure of it. It had been standing perfectly still just moments ago, facing outward. But now, its head was angled toward me in a way that made it feel alive. It felt wrong, unnatural, like it had seen me, and that thought alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, clenching my fists. "It's just a trick of the light. You're overthinking it." But the doubt gnawed at me. I forced myself to turn my back to the scarecrow and look away, my mind desperately seeking a rational explanation. When I looked back again, I was met with the same unsettling sight. The scarecrow, which had been looking the other way just moments before, was now turned. Just enough to suggest that it had moved when I wasn't looking. I was sure of it now. I wasn't imagining things. These scarecrows were shifting positions. I took a step forward, my pulse quickening as I examined each figure more closely. Every time I turned my head, even for a moment, it seemed like they were subtly altering their stances, drawing closer. The movement was so slight that I could almost convince myself it hadn't happened, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But each time I turned away, the sensation of being stalked became harder to ignore. They weren't moving like ordinary scarecrows. It wasn't the kind of movement that you expect from the wind or from a shift in the atmosphere. No. These figures weren't just swaying in the breeze. They were changing positions in the blink of an eye when I wasn't looking, as though they were carefully positioning themselves around me. Watching. Waiting. The worst part was that I couldn't figure out how they were doing it. They weren't walking. They weren't shifting their weight in any obvious way. It was as though the space between them and me was growing smaller without them ever taking a step. This is insane, I thought. I'm losing my mind. They're just scarecrows. Just scarecrows. But the cold feeling in my chest remained. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, one of the scarecrows near the middle of the field, moved again. This time, I didn't blink. I didn't turn away. I didn't let myself look at anything else. I saw it. The scarecrow's arms, which had been hanging loosely by its sides, twitched. They raised, just slightly. Then the figure twisted its head, snapping toward me in an almost jerky motion. Its button eyes were no longer blank. They were now focused on me, staring straight at me. I froze. It wasn't supposed to be possible. There was no way that could happen. I was sure of it. But there it was, the scarecrow's head tilted at an impossible angle, its form more alive now than ever before. And the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the rest of them were doing the same thing, shifting, inching closer, aligning themselves with some unseen plan. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's just your mind," I told myself, "playing tricks on you. They're not moving. You're just paranoid." But the unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts refused to let go. I was being watched. I was being stalked by these figures, and no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the feeling only grew stronger. I slowly turned away, not daring to look back at the scarecrow now. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, each step I took away from the field bringing a strange sense of relief, though I knew it wasn't over. The fear was still there, lingering like a shadow, hanging heavy in the air. I couldn't explain what was happening. But whatever it was more than just the wind, more than just the light. I wasn't alone out here. I never had been. I couldn't leave fast enough. Every step I took away from the field felt like an inch closer to escaping something that wasn't just in my mind anymore. My hands were trembling, my heart beating erratically in my chest as I hurried back to my car. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long, ominous shadows over the road ahead, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that cursed field as possible. I reached my car, throwing open the door with a frantic rush. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, searching the rear view for any sign of movement in the field behind me. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of grass, the scarecrows still standing like lifeless figures, as though they had never shifted at all. But the longer I stared at them, the more it felt like they were there, somewhere, watching. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, the sound of the car roaring to life almost too loud in the oppressive silence. My hands were slick with sweat as I put the car into gear, my foot pressing down on the gas pedal. But even as I pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something was wrong. I felt it in my bones. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was still there, hanging in the air like a cloud. It wasn't just the scarecrows anymore. It was something else, something more sinister. I glanced in the side mirror, half expecting to see a dark shape following me, emerging from the field. But there was nothing. No movement. The road behind me was empty, nothing more than the winding stretch of asphalt that led me farther away from that place. It's just paranoia, I thought. You're just overreacting. It's nothing. But the thought did little to ease the cold, gnawing dread clawing at the back of my mind. Every few seconds, my eyes flicked to the mirror again, but nothing changed. The field behind me seemed as still as it had been before, too still, too quiet, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. The road ahead twisted, the horizon stretching far into the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't moving fast enough. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, but the car seemed to crawl, as if the road itself was pulling me back, trying to trap me in place. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. It wasn't just the field anymore. It was the very air around me, heavy and thick with a presence that seemed to be closing in on me. It was as though I was walking into a trap, my every move watched by unseen eyes. A tightness in my chest grew with every mile I drove, and no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just a step behind. I tried to convince myself that I was being irrational, that it was just the isolation of the place playing tricks on my mind. But the more I drove, the more the sense of being trapped deepened. It was like I was caught in an invisible web, one I couldn't escape, no matter how far I went. There was something closing in on me, something watching, waiting, like a predator circling its prey. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. My breath caught in my throat. For the first time since I had left the field, something had changed. A shadow, small at first, appeared in the distance, moving as if following the same path I had taken. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, just a blur of a distant tree or a cloud. But the shadow moved with me. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. Panic surged in my chest. I couldn't breathe. The tightness in my throat felt like hands choking me, and my eyes frantically scanned the road ahead. There was nowhere to pull over, no escape. My grip on the wheel tightened even more, knuckles aching, as I sped up, trying to outrun whatever it was that was following me. But the shadow didn't disappear. It grew darker, clearer, as though it was gaining on me, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. I could feel it now, pressing down on me, like a weight pushing me lower and lower, making it harder to breathe. I looked at the mirror again. The shadow had grown larger, now unmistakable. It was following me, drawing closer with every passing second. I turned my head to look at the road ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one behind me. No cars. No people. Just the empty stretch of road. What is it? I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks or if it was really there, but I felt it. I felt its presence, closing in like the tightening of a noose around my neck. A creeping realization began to settle over me. It wasn't just the field anymore. The feeling of being trapped wasn't confined to that place. It had followed me. It was here with me, now. Something was watching me. Something I couldn't see. Something that wouldn't let me escape. The next few days passed in a haze, the world around me seeming both too sharp and too dull, as if reality itself had warped into something I couldn't quite grasp. I thought the fear would fade once I left the field behind. That maybe I had imagined the whole thing, my mind was just playing tricks on me, overworked and exhausted. But that didn't happen. The unease settled into my bones, a gnawing, persistent sensation that I couldn't shake. It followed me. Everywhere. In the corners of my vision, in the silence of my apartment, in the rustling of leaves outside my window. It wasn't just a lingering thought. It was a presence. A quiet, unsettling weight that pressed against me from every side. I tried to go about my daily routine. I went to work, made dinner, did the little things that should have distracted me. But no matter how much I tried to lose myself in the mundane, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. And then the oddities started. At first, it was small things, nothing that would raise alarms if I weren't already on edge. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter that I was sure I'd put away the night before. A chair in my living room that had somehow been moved a few inches, just enough to make me question whether I had left it like that. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, tapping along the hallway when no one else was there. I told myself it was nothing. That I was just tired, that my nerves were shot from the lingering fear of the field. But then, one night, as I sat alone in the dimly lit living room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. Soft. Distant. Yet it felt right there, as though someone was standing in the room with me, just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I froze, listening. It was too faint to make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, a low murmur, almost like a chant. I immediately looked around the room, my eyes darting to the windows, to the empty space in the corner. But there was nothing. Only the quiet, oppressive stillness of my apartment. I tried to brush it off, but my mind was racing. It's just the wind, I told myself. You're overthinking it. It's all in your head. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The whisper. So close, I could almost feel it against my ear. I whipped around, my breath coming fast, but there was no one. Just the empty room. I checked the windows, locked tight as they always were. No one outside. Yet still, that feeling, the presence, lingered. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something even stranger. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was wrong. Not in any immediately noticeable way, but enough to make my stomach turn. It was subtle, but when I looked at myself, I saw something that shouldn't have been there, the faint outline of a figure standing just behind me. A shadow that didn't match my own, a silhouette that flickered out of sight the moment I turned to face it. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared at the mirror, my breath coming in shallow, panic gasps. But there was nothing there. Nothing except me. It's nothing, I told myself again. You're seeing things. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I felt the truth lurking in the corners of my mind. Something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. The whispers didn't stop, and I could swear I heard them in the walls, in the air. I'd drift off only to jolt awake, heart racing, to the sound of something shifting, something moving just out of view. I felt like I was losing touch with reality, like I was being pulled deeper into something that I couldn't see or understand. And then the worst part, when I left my apartment the next morning, I found something outside that stopped me cold. The small garden at the front of the building, usually neat and quiet, had been disturbed. It wasn't just the flowers, though they were bent and broken in odd places. It was the soil. The ground had been dug up in random patches, deep claw-like marks gouged into the earth as though something, or someone, had been searching through it. A chill ran through me, and I found myself backing away, not wanting to look too closely, but unable to tear my eyes away from the damage. The soil still looked fresh, disturbed in a way that suggested it had been done recently. I felt it again. The presence. Like something was waiting just out of reach, watching me from the shadows. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe animals had done it. Maybe someone had been digging for something, though I couldn't imagine why they would have left it looking so unnatural. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a coincidence. The field, the scarecrows, had followed me. They weren't just in my mind. They were real, and they were coming for me. They were getting closer. I didn't know what they were, or why they had chosen me, but I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The hunt had begun. I tried to push the unease aside, but the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The sensation of being followed, of being watched, seemed to grow with every passing day. It was like a constant, suffocating presence hanging over me, just out of sight. I could feel it wherever I went, at the grocery store, on the streets, even while I was locked away in the quiet of my apartment. But it wasn't until I found myself back near the field that I truly understood what was happening. I hadn't meant to return. I had convinced myself that the place, the figures, had been nothing more than a bad memory, a moment of panic caused by a mind too stressed, too paranoid. But I couldn't shake it. The thought of the scarecrows, standing motionless in the field, had lingered in my mind, growing darker, more insistent with each passing day. I couldn't help myself. I had to see it again. I had to prove to myself that it was nothing. So, I drove out there. The weather was overcast, the air heavy with humidity, thick and oppressive. The field stretched out before me, just as it had that first time, quiet, still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The scarecrows stood in their usual spots, their lifeless bodies hanging limp on rusted poles, but there was something different now. Something that made my skin crawl. I parked the car by the side of the road and got out, my footsteps muted on the gravel. I stood at the edge of the field, staring at the figures from a distance. At first, they seemed unchanged, just the same lifeless figures I'd seen before. But as my eyes scanned the row of scarecrows, I couldn't help but feel a growing unease. There was a strange stillness about them, something unnatural, like they were waiting, watching. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, the way the tall grass swayed, creating the illusion of movement. But then I noticed it. The way the scarecrow's eyes seemed to follow me. I stood still, trying not to blink, trying to keep my gaze fixed on them. One of the figures, an old, tattered scarecrow with a burlap sack for a head, stood at the far edge of the field, its stitched-up mouth twisted into a permanent, empty grin. I turned my head, just for a moment, to scan the others, and when I looked back at that one in particular, I swear it was staring at me. No longer facing away, but looking directly at me. My heart skipped a beat. I forced myself to look away, shaking my head as if I could shake the vision from my mind. It's nothing. Just a trick of the light. I repeated it over and over in my head, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I glanced away, then back again, the same scarecrow was watching me. The others, too, at least, it seemed that way. I took a step forward, and something in me screamed to turn around, to run. But my legs were rooted to the spot. Slowly, hesitantly, I moved closer, eyes darting back and forth, expecting the figures to move, to change in some way. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop myself from examining them even as my heart pounded in my chest. The more I stared, the more they seemed to shift, their gaze following my every movement. It was subtle, like they were aware of me. I blinked, and for a brief moment, one of the scarecrows seemed to tilt its head, just slightly. It was like it knew I was looking, and it was reacting, adjusting its posture, its very being to match my focus. I froze. The fear hit me hard, rushing through my body like a cold wave. I could feel the sweat collecting on the back of my neck, a sharp, tightening sensation in my chest. It's just my mind, I thought again, just a trick of the eye. But my pulse was racing, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I shook my head and forced myself to look away, turning to the car, trying to regain control of my thoughts. But when I did, I felt the pull again, the oppressive sense of being watched, of being hunted. I knew they were still there. I knew they were watching me, their eyes boring into my back, even though I couldn't see them. I didn't dare turn around to check. I had seen enough. I could feel their eyes on me, could feel them shifting in the corners of my mind, following me even as I moved. My breath caught in my throat, and I rushed back to the car, my feet stumbling over the gravel as I practically ran. I slammed the door shut behind me, the sound echoing in the silent air, and started the engine, peeling out onto the road. But as I drove away, the presence didn't fade. It stayed with me, clinging to me like a shadow, a suffocating reminder that I wasn't free of them. That they were still out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part? The part that made my stomach twist into knots? I knew they were following me with their eyes. Everywhere I went, I felt them. Watching, waiting. They weren't just in the field anymore. They were with me. I told myself it was nothing. That I was simply exhausted. That the isolation, the silence of being away from people, was messing with my mind. It made sense. I'd been living alone for too long, spending hours in my car, driving from place to place, trying to outrun something I couldn't even name. Being alone out here, in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization, could play tricks on anyone. So, I tried to rationalize the events, the scarecrow's eyes following me, the whispers that never seemed to stop, the feeling of something constantly lurking just beyond my sight. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, a combination of stress, fatigue, and my own fear working together to twist my perception of reality. It was a simple explanation, and it was one I clung to desperately. I had to. For days, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. That I'd been too focused on the scarecrows, too obsessed with them. Maybe they were always like that, I thought. Maybe I just hadn't noticed before. And the whispers? They could easily be the wind or the creaking of old pipes in the walls. The thing in the mirror, that fleeting shadow, it was nothing. Just shadows, just reflections. But the more I tried to explain it all away, the more the events refused to fade. They kept returning, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, until even my attempts at reason seemed flimsy, like paper-thin walls about to collapse under the weight of everything I couldn't explain. The thing was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The odd occurrences kept happening, little things that couldn't be brushed aside. Every time I turned a corner, I thought I saw a figure darting out of sight. At work, I heard footsteps behind me when no one was there. At night, the sound of the floorboards creaking beneath me made me freeze in my tracks, certain I wasn't alone, even though I knew there was no one around. It didn't help that the nightmares started again. They were the same each time. I'd be standing in that field, surrounded by the scarecrows, and I'd turn around to find their eyes locked onto me, their faces contorted into expressions that I couldn't quite make sense of, half grins, twisted frowns, mouths open in silent screams. I'd try to scream back, to run, but my legs were always heavy, like I was trudging through thick mud, the field stretching endlessly around me. And all the while, the whispers would grow louder, until they were more like voices, beckoning, calling my name. And every time I woke up from those dreams, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest, I felt it again, the presence. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real. The feeling lingered long after I opened my eyes. But even then, I tried to fight it. I tried to dismiss it as just a symptom of my nerves, of being isolated in a place I didn't belong. It was the isolation that was driving me mad. I was sure of it. I began distracting myself more, keeping busy, work, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. I even went so far as to drive out to the nearest town, just to be around people for a few hours. The voices, the dread, faded slightly while I was surrounded by others, when I could hear the hum of the town, the chatter of pedestrians, the honking of car horns. But the moment I returned to my apartment, to the silence of the empty rooms, it would all come rushing back. One night, I went to bed earlier than usual, hoping that maybe, if I slept long enough, I could finally outrun the unease that had become my constant companion. I pulled the covers up tightly, shut my eyes, and willed myself to sleep. But that night, the dream came again. Only this time, it was worse. The scarecrows weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving. They had come to life, twisting, swaying on their posts, their heads snapping around to face me. Their eyes, wide and cold, were fixed on me as if they could see me. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, heart racing. I looked around the room, trying to convince myself it was just a dream, that it couldn't be real. But the silence in the apartment felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was here. I threw back the covers, my hands trembling as I searched the room. Nothing. I stood by the window, staring into the darkness outside. The air felt thick, pressing in on me, and I could swear I saw something shift just beyond the glass. A shadow, moving. No, I told myself. It's just a tree. But I couldn't convince myself any longer. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The things I had been seeing, the sounds, the constant feeling of being watched, they were too real. They didn't belong to a tired mind or an overactive imagination. Maybe it's the isolation, I thought. But even as I told myself that, I knew deep down it wasn't true. It wasn't just that. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. Something following me. The rational part of me fought to hold on, to tell myself that I was still in control. But with each passing moment, I could feel it slipping away. And in the back of my mind, the fear grew stronger. What if I was wrong? What if the scarecrows weren't just a product of my imagination? What if they were real? I couldn't escape it. No matter how much I tried to distance myself from the field, from the creeping dread that followed me, it was always there, just out of sight, waiting for me to look away. But this time, there was something different. This time, I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't just seeing things. The scarecrows were moving. It started subtly, almost imperceptible at first. I'd be standing there, looking at them from the edge of the field, and I'd turn my head for just a moment, just to scan the horizon, or to take a breath, and when I looked back, they were closer. Not much, but enough to make my pulse quicken, enough to make my skin prickle with that suffocating sense of being watched. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe the angle of my vision had changed, or I was mistaken about where they had been standing. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't random. It wasn't a trick of the light. Every time I looked away, even for a second, the distance between us shrank. The scarecrows were getting closer, closing in around me, moving deliberately, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't some coincidence. They were watching me. They knew I wasn't looking. And when I turned my back, they took a step closer. I tried to stay calm, tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. Maybe the poles they were attached to were loose, and a gust of wind was shifting them slightly, making them appear to move. But that explanation fell apart the moment I saw one of them take a definitive step toward me, its tattered clothes rustling as it shifted, its wooden frame creaking in the silence. I froze. I couldn't move. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, couldn't look anywhere else. The scarecrow, I couldn't even call it that anymore, was no longer just an inanimate figure. It was alive. It was aware of me. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught in this awful, staring contest with something I couldn't understand. And that's when I realized there were more of them moving. At the edges of my vision, I could see the others shifting, their postures adjusting, creeping toward me in the same deliberate, methodical way. I finally snapped out of it, taking a shaky step back, then another, my breath ragged as panic began to flood my senses. I couldn't take my eyes off them as I backed away, but I couldn't stop myself either. With every step I took, they followed. My mind was a blur of confusion and fear. They're not real. They're just scarecrows. But they weren't just scarecrows anymore. They were something else. Something terrible. Something alive. I forced myself to turn away, to run, but even as I moved, I felt the weight of their eyes on me. I could feel them getting closer. In my mind, I could hear them rustling, creaking, stepping, as if they were right behind me, stalking me like prey. The sound of their movement was faint, but it was there, scraping, shifting, the hollow sound of wooden limbs creaking under the weight of their deliberate advance. I knew they were moving closer, knew they were closing in, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I had to get to the car. I had to get out of there. The distance from the field seemed endless as I ran, each step heavy with the knowledge that they were coming for me. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on me, urging me to hurry. But no matter how fast I ran, I felt them gaining on me, felt the terrible certainty that they weren't far behind. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced back at the field, just once, just to confirm what I already knew. The scarecrows were gone. But something was wrong. Something was off. The field was empty, the figures still. It didn't make sense. They'd been moving. I had seen them. But now, nothing. Not a single figure was out of place. They were waiting, but they weren't there. My heart raced, the fear still clinging to me, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the door, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror just one last time. And there they were, standing at the edge of the field, watching me. Their dark, empty eyes seemed to burn into me even from that distance, and I could feel the cold, suffocating weight of their gaze on the back of my neck. They were waiting. And somehow, I knew this wasn't the end. It had only just begun. I drove as fast as I could, my hands white-knuckling the steering wheel, my eyes darting back and forth between the road and the rearview mirror. The field was still behind me, but every time I looked back, I saw them. Those figures, unmoving in the distance, but somehow still there, watching, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I wasn't sure how long I drove, but I was a few miles out of town before I pulled over to the side of the road, the engine still running. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, and my body was drenched in sweat. I couldn't stop shaking. The adrenaline had worn off, and now only the numbness remained, a terrifying, overwhelming feeling that I was no longer in control of what was happening. I looked over at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see something move in the distance, but there was nothing. The field was gone, the dark outline of the scarecrows just a memory. I should have felt relief. But I didn't. I was still shaken, still filled with the oppressive fear that had followed me all the way out here. The terror wasn't from the scarecrows themselves, it was from the fact that I was being hunted. And I had no idea what they were, what they wanted, or how far they would go to catch me. The nightmare I had been trying to outrun was now my reality. I didn't know how to process it. I didn't know how to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't explain the things I'd seen. I couldn't explain the way the scarecrows moved when I wasn't looking. The fact that every time I turned my back, they were closer, always closer. My mind kept circling back to the same conclusion over and over again. They're hunting me. The thought was suffocating. It twisted my stomach into knots. I had to find out what they were, what they wanted. As I sat there in the car, trying to collect my thoughts, I heard it. A soft, faint scraping sound. I froze. My heart stopped in my chest. The sound was too familiar. It was the sound of something dragging across the ground. The same sound I'd heard in the field, only this time it was closer. It was coming from the woods beside the road. No. My mind screamed. It can't be. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, but nothing had changed. I was alone on the road. But the sound, scraping, shifting, it was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, calculated. They were here. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. I fumbled for the door handle, but it felt like my fingers didn't work. My brain was screaming at me to go, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the road, from the shadow that was slowly creeping into my view. I looked out the window. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was one of them. One of the scarecrows. Its face was twisted and grotesque, its body a malformed mix of straw and torn fabric. Its eyes were dark, sunken into its face, but I could feel them piercing me. I couldn't look away. The scarecrow didn't move at first. It just stood there, silent, still. But I knew it wasn't waiting. It wasn't still because it was just standing there. It was still because it was watching, calculating its next move. And then it did move. It took a step forward. Slowly. Deliberately. The sound of its feet scraping against the gravel was deafening in the stillness of the night. My breath hitched in my throat as I watched it approach, its hollow eyes locked on mine. I was frozen, my body completely paralyzed with fear. I couldn't scream, I couldn't think. The only thing I could do was watch. Watch as it came closer. I tried to reach for the door handle again, but my hand wouldn't move. It was like my body was betraying me. My heart thudded louder in my chest, and the scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was almost at the car now. And then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't see it happen, not exactly. It was a blur, a flash of movement too fast for my mind to fully process. The scarecrow's hands slammed against the window, and I jumped, my scream catching in my throat. I pressed myself against the seat, gasping for air, heart racing, every muscle screaming at me to move. I yanked the door open, throwing myself out of the car, stumbling onto the road, not daring to look back. I heard it, scraping, shuffling, the unmistakable sound of something chasing me, gaining on me with every step. I ran. I ran faster than I had ever run before, my feet pounding the dirt road, my breath ragged and desperate. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own heart, the rush of panic in my ears, and the terrible, relentless scraping of the scarecrow behind me. It was getting closer. I had no idea how far I ran, how long it took, but at some point, my legs gave out beneath me. I collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath, my mind spinning, my body trembling. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stayed there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to even lift my head. I didn't know what had happened to the scarecrow, or if it was still out there. All I knew was that I had just barely escaped, and that I wasn't safe. They were still hunting me. I don't know how much time has passed since the night I ran from that field, since the scarecrow almost caught me. Days? Weeks? The days blend together now, a constant loop of fear and confusion, stretching into a horizon I can't quite reach. Everything feels like it's slipping away from me, like I'm losing my grip on what's real and what's not. The world around me doesn't feel the same. It's like it's wearing a mask, hiding its true face, and every time I try to pull it away, I find myself more lost than before. The shadows are deeper. The silence is heavier. Even in the middle of a crowded room, I feel alone. I haven't gone back to the field. I haven't even driven near it. I know better now. But it doesn't matter. No matter how far I go, no matter where I turn, the fear follows me. It's in everything. The air. The walls. The corners of my vision. I can't stop looking over my shoulder. I see things now. Or maybe I don't. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I think I see them, the scarecrows, lurking in the reflection of windows, in the periphery of my vision, just standing there, waiting. But I always convince myself it's nothing. That it's just my mind playing tricks on me. That I'm just tired. That it's the isolation. That I'm just overthinking it. But deep down, I know. I know it's real. And I know they're still watching. It's the little things that are driving me mad. The strange sounds that I hear in the quiet of the night, the whispers I can't understand. The flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I'll turn, thinking it's just a shadow, only to find nothing there. But I feel it. I feel their presence, lingering like a heavy fog that won't lift. I can't escape it. It follows me everywhere. I try to drown it out. I try to fill my days with anything that will block it out. I go to work. I see people. I talk to them, laugh with them, pretend that I'm normal. But I know I'm not. I know something has changed inside me, something that I can't explain. The walls of this little town, this place I've tried to make my refuge, are closing in on me. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I feel their eyes on me. I can see them in my dreams now, those figures, those scarecrows, just standing there, always watching, never moving, waiting. But I know they're not just waiting. They're hunting. I can feel them drawing closer. I can feel it in my bones, in the way the air shifts around me. I can't tell if I'm imagining it. I don't know what's real anymore. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, breath coming in sharp gasps. The sound that woke me was unmistakable. It was the same sound I heard in the field, the scraping, the rustling. I shot up from the bed, eyes wide, heart racing. For a moment, I thought I was still there, back at the edge of the field. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look. But the fear, the terror, was so overwhelming, it was like something was pushing me, urging me to open my eyes. I turned slowly, painfully, and I swear, just for a second, I saw it. In the corner of my room, standing motionless, was a figure. A scarecrow. Its face was shadowed, its form barely visible in the dark, but I knew what it was. I knew what it meant. I couldn't breathe. I closed my eyes, willing it to disappear, to be nothing more than a trick of the mind, a product of the nightmare. But when I opened them again, it was gone. The room was empty. I convinced myself it was just a hallucination. That it was the stress, the fear getting to me. That it was the isolation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Every time I close my eyes now, I see them. Every time I look away from the window, every time I turn a corner, I feel them. I feel their eyes on me. And I can't escape it. I thought I could outrun them. I thought I could leave that field behind. But the truth is, I can't. The field is in me now. It's in my mind. It's like I'm trapped inside this endless cycle of fear, a web I can't break free from. And every time I think I'm safe, every time I think I've escaped, I feel them creeping closer. Their presence is suffocating, and I don't know how much longer I can take it. I'm losing my mind. I know it. And I'm terrified of what will happen when I finally snap. I tried to leave. I told myself it was the only way, the only chance I had left to break free from the suffocating grip of fear that had been tightening around my chest since the moment I first laid eyes on that field. I packed my things, took what little I had left, and drove. I didn't have a destination. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away from that place. Away from them. At first, it seemed like it worked. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty, offering the promise of distance, of space. I thought I could outrun it all, outrun the fear, the madness that was chasing me. I drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the dark, and I let myself believe for a while that maybe, just maybe, I could escape. But the further I went, the worse it got. I wasn't looking for any particular place, just away. The highway faded into narrow roads, the winding country lanes unfamiliar and desolate. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter where I was anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the fatigue of driving so long in the dark, the isolation gnawing at my senses. But it wasn't. I could feel them. Watching. Every time I turned a corner, every time I glanced into a mirror, it was there, a shadow, a movement, a flicker of something in the periphery. They were always just outside my sight, like they were waiting for the moment I'd look away. And then, just as quickly, they'd disappear, like they never existed in the first place. But I felt them. I stopped at a small gas station, trying to shake the feeling, trying to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the pavement. I was the only one there, the place empty except for the hum of the vending machine and the distant sound of a dog barking. But even in this quiet place, I felt it. The pressure. The unease. Like the air itself had grown thick, suffocating. I couldn't stand still. My skin was crawling, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I stood there, pumping gas. I kept checking the corners of the lot, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, looking for something, someone. I wasn't sure if I was looking for the scarecrows themselves or just for anything that might confirm my suspicion that I wasn't alone. And then it came. A faint rustling, a scraping sound, distant but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, my stomach twisted. I glanced toward the far side of the lot, where a row of trees bordered the edge of the road. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I didn't want to look, but I had to. My eyes moved back to the trees, and that's when I saw it. There, just at the edge of the tree line, a figure. Tall. Motionless. A scarecrow. I froze. My body went cold, the gas pump slipping from my hand as I backed away. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure stood perfectly still, staring straight at me, the outline of its silhouette almost blending with the night. My mind screamed at me to get in the car, to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something was wrong. The way it stood there, it wasn't like before. It wasn't just a statue, a figment of my imagination. It was alive. And then, just like that, it was gone. I looked away for just a second, just a moment, and when I turned back, the spot where it had stood was empty. The wind moved through the trees, the same rustling sound I had heard earlier. I told myself I was imagining things. It wasn't real. It was just my fear, my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But the truth clawed at me with every step I took. They weren't just in that field. They were following me. I got back in my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove away, the road stretching out before me, but I didn't feel free. I couldn't escape it. Every time I looked in the mirror, every time I passed an empty stretch of land, I felt them. I couldn't outrun them. It didn't matter how far I went. No matter where I turned, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that field, I could feel their presence like an invisible thread tied to my soul, pulling me back. The scarecrows were out there, and they were always watching. I kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. The road seemed endless, but I couldn't escape the feeling that they were never far behind, that no matter where I went, I would always be a step away from their reach. And deep down, I knew it wasn't the road that was trapping me. It was them. They were the ones that had me cornered. And there was nowhere left to run. I can't stop hearing them. The voices. They started out as whispers, soft and distant, like they were coming from far away, just at the edge of my hearing. But they're growing louder, clearer, and they're everywhere. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the hum of the engine as I drove, the tires on the road playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. No matter how much I tried to dismiss it, the voices kept getting closer, more real. They started while I was on the highway, heading further away from the field. The road seemed endless, stretching out in front of me, the landscape slowly slipping into a blur of brown and green under the setting sun. I thought I had outrun everything. Thought I was finally free. But then I heard it. A soft rustling, a whisper, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I jerked my head, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, someone, there, but nothing was there. I told myself it was nothing. Just your mind playing tricks, I thought. You're tired. You're just imagining things. But the whispers didn't stop. They became clearer, more distinct. At first, I couldn't make out the words. They were just sounds, like a murmur, faint and almost melodic, carrying on the wind. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the road was empty. The trees on either side were still. The world felt frozen in place, holding its breath, waiting. I kept driving. I told myself to keep my eyes on the road. I was alone. It was just my imagination. But the voices kept growing, becoming louder, more insistent. I couldn't ignore them anymore. They sounded like they were speaking to me. Not in words I understood, but in some twisted, distorted language, a mixture of syllables and sounds that didn't make sense. The tones were soft at first, like distant murmurs, but as I pressed on, they became more forceful, more urgent. It was like they were calling to me. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, trying to speed away from the sound, but it followed. It was always there, just out of reach. I tried to block it out. I turned the radio on full blast, cranking it up until the noise drowned out the whispers. But even then, they didn't stop. They pushed through, cutting through the static like a blade. It was like they were inside my head, crawling beneath my skin, scratching at the walls of my mind. I pulled over, hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The car was parked on the side of the road, the engine running, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was paralyzed. The whispers had stopped, but now there was something else. A presence. A weight, heavy in the air, as if the very atmosphere around me had thickened, pressing down on me. I could feel it, pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then it came again, faint, but clear. The whispers. I could almost hear the words now, distorted, but they were unmistakable. Turn back. The voice was low and slow, like a warning, but it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Too many, all overlapping, blending together into a cacophony of sound that made my head throb with pain. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground beneath me, from the very air I was breathing. Turn back. I could barely breathe. My mind was spinning, each word like a nail being driven into my skull. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the voices only grew louder, more persistent. Turn back. Don't look away. They are watching you. It was like they were speaking directly to me, drawing me into their web, forcing me to listen. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely keep them on the wheel. I looked around, panic clawing at me, but there was no one. Just the empty road, the trees swaying gently in the wind. There was nothing but silence. But I could still hear the voices. In my head. In my bones. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't work. The whispers were inside me now, crawling through my thoughts, twisting them, distorting them until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I didn't know how long I sat there, my eyes wide, staring into the nothingness, listening to the voices that were driving me insane. But I knew one thing for sure now. The scarecrows were never just in that field. They were inside me, in my head, in the very fabric of my reality. They were part of me now. I could feel them, watching, waiting. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. Every minute felt like it was unraveling me, pulling me deeper into the madness. And the voices kept telling me to turn back. But I didn't know where to turn anymore. I don't know how I ended up back here. The road had twisted, turned, and looped, but I had somehow found my way back to that damn field. I swear I wasn't trying to get here. I wasn't trying to return to that place where everything started, where everything went wrong. But the feeling, that pulling sensation, that unrelenting weight in my chest, had led me back. It was like the road itself was drawing me closer, guiding me to it. At first, I thought maybe it was just another trick, another instance of my mind playing games with me. Maybe I was just too tired, too desperate, too far gone to think clearly. But as I turned onto the familiar dirt road, the one that led to that cursed spot, my stomach dropped. I was back. And the field was waiting. The scarecrows were there, standing in the same eerie, unnatural stillness they always had. But there was something different about them now. Something closer. My car came to a screeching halt, the tires crunching on the gravel as I stared at the field, my breath quickening. They weren't in their same positions. No, they were closer now. As if they had moved since the last time I had seen them. I wasn't imagining it. They were definitely closer. I didn't get out of the car. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, but I forced myself to look. I had to. The whispers from earlier were still there, haunting me, swirling around in the back of my mind like a storm. They were louder now, more insistent, but I couldn't look away. And then, something moved. I almost didn't catch it at first. A slight shift. A slow, deliberate motion. One of the scarecrows had turned its head. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was real. Its lifeless, stitched face was now facing me, its hollow eyes staring into my soul. I froze. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't dare blink. But it was too late. The others were moving too. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't breathe. They shifted, like they were being manipulated by invisible strings, drawing closer to me. Slowly. so slowly, but with purpose. I couldn't see the movement at first, couldn't tell what exactly was happening, but I could feel it. They were closing the distance. I tore my eyes away from the field, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was reeling, my body screaming for me to move, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in this invisible web. And then I looked back. One of the scarecrows had taken a step forward. I don't know how I knew it. I just knew. It was the way it stood, the subtle change in its stance. The ground beneath it seemed to shift slightly, as though it had taken a step that wasn't supposed to be possible. But I saw it. And that's when I realized the truth. They were moving. They weren't just standing there like twisted statues. They were alive, in a way that defied all sense of logic. The scarecrows, those figures that had haunted me, followed me, tormented me, were coming for me. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were hunting me. I tried to start the car, but my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't grip the keys. The engine sputtered, then died, as if it too could feel the presence of whatever it was that had taken over this cursed land. My breath came in short, desperate gasps as I fumbled with the ignition, my heart racing, pounding in my ears, my skin slick with sweat. The whispers grew louder now, a chorus of voices, all calling to me, all commanding me to look at them. They weren't just words anymore. They were a force, a wave of sound that crashed into me, pulling me down into the depths of my own fear. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see them moving, getting closer, with every second that ticked by. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the field. From the scarecrows. One of them took another step. This time, it was unmistakable. Its legs shifted, moving through the dry grass with an unnatural fluidity that chilled me to the bone. The one closest to me, it was the one I had seen turn its head, was coming. And as it moved, I saw something in its hollow eyes. Something intelligent. Something aware. It knows I'm here. The thought shot through my mind like a bolt of lightning, sharp and clear, and it sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. The scarecrows weren't just figures. They weren't just twisted, lifeless forms in a field. They were predators. And they were coming for me. They had been from the beginning. And now, there was no way out. I could feel it. Their presence. It was closing in. The air around me was thick with it. I had never been more aware of my own helplessness. They were closer now, and their movements were more pronounced. The air was thick with their weight, and I knew, without a doubt, that if I didn't move soon, I wouldn't make it out alive. But no matter how fast I tried to start the car, no matter how hard I tried to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was no escape from this place. No escape from them. I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? The air around me felt frozen, as if time itself had become irrelevant, stretching out into an endless void. The scarecrows were no longer just figures in a field. They were alive, or something far worse, an extension of the fear that had been chasing me ever since I first laid eyes on them. I tried again to start the car, but it was no use. The engine sputtered and died, as if it too had given up. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't force my hands to stop shaking. I looked out the window, back at the field. The scarecrows were closer now, so close that I could see the details of their grotesque faces, stitched together with thread and torn fabric, their hollow eyes gleaming in the fading light. They weren't just standing there anymore. They were moving, step by slow, deliberate step. Their grotesque bodies shifting, creaking with every motion, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. It was as though the field itself had become a trap, an inescapable snare pulling me back in, no matter how far I tried to go. The whispers were growing louder, the voices in my head becoming a constant hum, like the buzz of an insect trapped in my skull. Turn back. Don't look away. They're waiting. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voices, but it didn't work. The sound was inside me now, inside my very thoughts. I could feel their presence, feel them drawing closer with each passing second. They were moving, stalking, hunting, and I was their prey. I looked around frantically, searching for any way to escape. But there was nothing. The road behind me was the same as the road in front of me, endless, empty, and silent. There was no way out. No way to break free from this nightmare. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell myself that this was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was imagining everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping this place. There was no escaping the scarecrows, or whatever they were. They had been waiting for me, watching me. From the moment I had first set foot in that field, they had been drawing me closer, pulling me into their web. And now, it was too late. I was trapped. The realization hit me with the weight of 1,000 bricks, crushing me under the sheer pressure of it. The dread, the terror, it had become a part of me now. It was in my blood, in my bones, wrapping itself around me like a vice. I could feel it, tightening its grip with every passing moment. I looked back at the scarecrows again, and this time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There were more of them. At least 24, standing in a line across the field, their eyes following my every movement. Some of them were no longer just standing still, they were shifting, taking steps, drawing nearer, as though they were closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was sit there, trapped in the car, feeling the weight of their presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I knew they weren't going to kill me, at least not right away. No. They were going to watch me. To make me feel the weight of their eyes on me, to let the fear build until it consumed me. I was already slipping, already losing myself in the madness. The longer I stayed here, the harder it would be to hold on to my sanity. The dread had become my constant companion. It was always there, a gnawing, relentless presence in the back of my mind. It followed me, seeped into my thoughts, and filled every waking moment with terror. There was no escape from it. No escape from them. I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't just trapped by the scarecrows. I was trapped by my own fear. I had already lost the battle long before I ever stepped foot in that field. And now, I had no choice but to wait. To wait for whatever was coming next. Because the scarecrows weren't just out there anymore. They were inside me. I tried to think, tried to pull myself together. I couldn't just sit in that car, staring at the field, waiting for whatever it was that had me in its grip to do next. I had to understand it. I had to figure out what was happening, why it was happening to me. So, I did what I should have done days ago. I searched. I couldn't shake the idea that the scarecrows were part of something bigger, something ancient, something rooted in folklore and superstition. I'd never believed in such things before, but now everything felt too real, too impossible to ignore. The way they moved when I wasn't looking, the way they followed me, hunted me. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. It couldn't be. I spent hours poring through whatever I could find, books, old news articles, websites, anything that could explain this nightmare. I didn't know where to start, but desperation drove me. I combed through pages about haunted places, cursed objects, rural myths. Anything, everything that might explain the field, the scarecrows, the way they seemed to be alive. At first, there was nothing. Just stories of ordinary scarecrows, simple folk traditions. But then I found something. Something that made my skin crawl. The scarecrows weren't just figures used to scare away birds. They were watchers. Hunters. According to the old texts, there was a legend, a forgotten myth passed down in whispers by the isolated communities that once lived in Idaho. It spoke of an ancient ritual, one that involved creating effigies from the land itself, figures made of straw and bone that could move, think, and hunt. These beings were said to be born of fear, of the dark corners of the human mind that most people ignored. It was said that when a person ventured too close to these figures, they could sense it, the fear. And once they had sensed it, they would begin to hunt, stalking their prey silently, always moving just out of sight. But the more fear you showed, the stronger they became. The more you ran, the closer they got. The myth warned of a field, the field of death, where these creatures were said to be most active. A place where the line between reality and nightmare was thin, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. It was then that the cold truth hit me. This wasn't just a field. This wasn't just a few scarecrows. It was a trap. A trap that had been set long before I arrived. The more I read, the more I realized how helpless I was. The stories didn't just warn about the scarecrows. They said that anyone who ventured into their domain, anyone who sought to escape them or understand them, would be caught in their web, unable to leave. That was the curse. To face the terror, to run from it, to try and rationalize it, all of it would only feed them. And now, it was feeding them. The book described a final warning. If you've seen them move, if you've heard them whisper, you are already marked. They will hunt you until you break, until you succumb to your own fear. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling, heart racing. It wasn't just a myth. It was a warning. I had become the prey. And the scarecrows weren't going to stop until they had me. The realization paralyzed me. It was like the weight of the truth had crushed me under its enormity. I thought I could outrun it, escape it, reason my way out of it. But I couldn't. The more I resisted, the more I tried to break free from the nightmare, the closer they would come. The closer they were. I could feel the fear crawling up my spine, the whispers growing louder in my ears, curling around my thoughts. And I knew, deep down, that I had crossed a line I couldn't return from. I was part of the story now. The curse had already been set in motion. And no matter how hard I fought, no matter how many books I read, there was only one thing left to do. I had to face them. But I was already too late. They knew I was coming. They were watching. I couldn't escape the realization. It was as if I had stepped into a trap that had been set long before my arrival. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the evidence was right in front of me. The scarecrows were getting closer. It started slowly, imperceptibly. At first, I thought I was imagining it, Perhaps I had simply misremembered where they were standing the last time I had seen them. But the longer I stayed in the field, the more I realized that something wasn't right. Every time I looked away, even for just a moment, they were closer. They were moving, not in a natural way, like wind-blown straw, but with purpose, with intent. It was subtle at first. One scarecrow that had once been standing at the far edge of the field was now closer to the others, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were watching me. I turned my head to look at another part of the field, then quickly back again, and it had moved again, closer, its posture more menacing, its shadow longer. I wasn't imagining it. It was happening. I forced myself to look at them, to keep my eyes locked on each one of the figures, to defy the fear clawing at my insides. I watched, but the moment I blinked or shifted my gaze, just for a second, they would inch forward, always closer. They seemed to be drawn to the fear in my mind. It was as if the more I feared them, the faster they moved, creeping toward me with deliberate slowness, waiting for the moment I would lose focus. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had read about this, heard vague stories about cursed places where things would move when you weren't looking. But this was different. This wasn't just a myth. This wasn't a trick of the mind. This was real. The fear that surged through me, the panic that twisted my stomach, that was real. I tried to control my breathing. I tried to steady my hands, but they trembled uncontrollably. The more I stared at the scarecrows, the more my mind began to unravel, and the more they came closer. My heart raced as the shadows lengthened in the field, their unnatural figures growing larger in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly to the left, just to check behind me, to see if they had moved, and when I looked back, one was standing closer, right at the edge of the road, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, and the sudden rustle of the wind felt like a whisper. No, a warning. Don't look away. Don't blink. Don't move. I forced myself to keep my gaze locked on them, desperately trying to hold on to my sanity. The closer they came, the more the air around me seemed to suffocate, the shadows darkening and twisting with an unnatural intensity. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my body wouldn't obey. The fear was too strong now. I looked at each scarecrow, and they seemed to stare back, silent, unmoving, yet so alive in their stillness. And every time I looked away, I could feel it, could feel them shifting, getting closer. I realized then that the field wasn't just a place. It was a game, and I was its target. A game where the rules were simple: never look away, never lose focus. And the moment you do, they would be on you. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control. About holding onto my mind, my will, long enough to escape their grasp. But the more I struggled, the more I realized how powerless I was. The scarecrows were feeding on my fear. And every second I spent trying to understand them, trying to make sense of this nightmare, I was only drawing them closer. It happened while I let my guard down, just for a split second. I had been staring at the scarecrows for what felt like hours, willing myself not to blink, not to look away, as if somehow I could outrun the inevitable. The fear clawing at my insides, the paranoia creeping into my thoughts, it was becoming too much. Every time I shifted my gaze, the scarecrows moved, closer, closer, closing in on me like shadows in the dark. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, something darker than the shadows cast by the scarecrows. I forced my eyes to stay focused on the figures before me, but I couldn't ignore it. Something else was out there, something that didn't belong, something that wasn't made of straw and old clothes. A shape. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding, but as soon as I saw it, I froze. There, just beyond the line of scarecrows, stood a figure, tall, humanoid, with an unnatural stillness that made the world around it seem to hold its breath. It wasn't moving. It wasn't making a sound. But I could feel it. I could feel it watching me. It wasn't like the scarecrows. It was darker, sharper, like a shadow that had taken form. Its outline was indistinct, as though it were made of smoke, shifting and flickering in the dim light. But there was no doubt in my mind, it was there. Watching. Waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. Every instinct told me to run, to get out, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like I was rooted to the ground, my body unwilling to leave, yet every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee. The figure didn't step forward. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, impossibly tall and thin, its form almost melting into the shadows of the field. But I knew it was no illusion. I could feel its eyes on me, if they even had eyes. There was no face, no clear features, just an overwhelming sense of presence. It wasn't part of the field. It wasn't part of the scarecrows. It was something else, something beyond anything I could understand. And its stillness filled me with a terror that left me paralyzed. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt like I was drowning in its gaze, trapped in a darkness that didn't belong in the world I knew. It was as if the very air had thickened around me, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from that oppressive silence, but the figure held me in place. It had no face, no eyes, yet I knew it was aware of me. It was aware. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, I looked away, just for a second, just a blink to break the connection. I thought I could look back and it would be gone, a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind. But when I looked back, when I turned my eyes back to the field, I felt my stomach drop. The figure was closer. It hadn't moved, not in the way anything alive would, but I could feel the space between us had shrunk. The air around it seemed darker, thicker. It was as if it had pulled closer without making a single step, its presence now filling the space where the scarecrows had once stood. I could almost hear it, faint whispers, low and jagged, like the rustling of dead leaves, only it wasn't the wind. It was waiting. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know if it was just another piece of the nightmare, another part of the trap that I had unwittingly walked into. But it didn't matter. The fear was already inside me, crawling under my skin, filling my chest with a cold dread. And then it moved, or rather, it shifted. Not in the way a living thing moves, but in the way a shadow might stretch or bend under a light. A slow, deliberate motion that sent a tremor through me. It didn't come closer, but somehow it felt like it had. Like it was getting nearer with every passing moment. The scarecrows were forgotten now. The field had become a prison, and this thing, this presence, was its warden. I tried to force my feet to move, tried to get away, but the air was thick with the weight of its stare. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and all I could do was stare back into the dark void where its face should have been. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting for me to do something, anything, to make my next move. But I was already too late. I realized, in that moment, that it had always been waiting. Waiting for me to look away. And I had done it. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. I had spent so much time in that damned field, circling around the fear that gripped me, trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it all. But now, standing there, staring at the scarecrows and that thing, the shadow that waited, I knew what I had to do. I had to confront it. I had to face whatever it was that had been hunting me. Maybe, just maybe, if I understood it, I could escape it. It was the only way, the only chance I had left. But as I moved toward the scarecrows, something shifted in the air, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it deep in my bones. The field seemed to close in around me, the land itself turning against me. It wasn't just the movement of the scarecrows anymore. It was the very presence of the place, the way the earth beneath my feet felt wrong, as though it had become a living thing, watching, listening. Each step I took felt heavier than the last. My legs began to shake, and the ground beneath me seemed to pulse with a rhythm that wasn't natural. The earth thickened, and the silence was almost deafening, as though the world had held its breath. I wanted to turn around, to leave, but I was too far gone. The dread had already taken hold of me, and I couldn't stop now. The scarecrows were still in place, standing motionless, their faces hidden behind tattered masks of cloth and straw. But I knew they weren't just statues. They were watching me. They were aware. With every step I took, I could feel their eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look away from their still forms. And that's when it hit me, the fear, raw and unrelenting, that seemed to radiate from the scarecrows themselves. It wasn't just the presence of the shadow anymore, it was the scarecrows. The moment I approached them, I felt it. A pressure building in my chest, a weight that pressed down on me with each footstep. I tried to breathe, but it was as if the air itself had thickened, each inhale pulling in more of the field's suffocating presence. The ground felt soft underfoot, as though the earth had become something that could swallow me whole, and the wind had stopped moving, leaving the world unnervingly still. I stopped in my tracks. A creeping sensation spread through my body, a paralyzing fear that tightened around my chest and throat. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts muddled. My body refused to obey me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. I felt it more than I saw it, the growing weight of their attention, the scarecrow's eyes boring into me, pressing down from all directions. The ground beneath my feet seemed to sink, like I was being drawn into the very fabric of the field. The terror was real now, tangible. It wasn't just my imagination playing tricks. The scarecrows were alive, and they were hungry. A low creaking sound came from one of them, the one furthest to the left. I didn't dare look at it directly. I could feel it. The movement. The shift. The danger. It wasn't just the scarecrows that were watching me. It was the land. The trees around the field, the air above me, the very soil beneath my feet, they were all part of it. Part of the thing that hunted me. I tried to take another step forward, but my body was frozen. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't. I felt the presence behind me before I heard the sound, the faintest whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. The shadow. That thing. It had followed me, waiting for the moment when I would turn and face it. But now, I wasn't even sure which was the greater threat, the scarecrows closing in on me, or the shadow waiting patiently, growing closer with every passing second. Every breath I took seemed to make the fear worse, the weight heavier. I stood there, paralyzed, caught between the two. The scarecrows didn't move. Not yet. But I knew they were watching, waiting, feeding off my fear. And the longer I stood there, the closer they came. I had been foolish. I thought I could fight it, confront it, but now I saw the truth. I wasn't meant to confront this thing. No one was. The field had its hold on me, and there was no way out. I don't know how I did it. I don't know what part of me still had the strength to move, to run, but in that moment, as the terror closed in around me, I broke free. It wasn't a heroic escape. It wasn't calculated or brave. It was instinct. My body, shaking and numb, finally snapped into action. My legs, heavy as lead, carried me forward, but my mind screamed for me to stop, to stay in the field, stay in the grip of the fear that had paralyzed me. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it take me. Not yet. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the deafening rush of blood in my ears as my feet pounded the earth beneath me. I stumbled through the field, the ground uneven, the weight of the scarecrow's eyes still pressing on my back. I didn't dare look up. Didn't dare look at what was behind me. The wind picked up suddenly, rushing past me as though the field itself was shoving me away. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tightening with each step I took. I could feel them getting closer, could feel the heat of their gaze, their presence pulling at me from every direction. Then, just as I thought I was going to collapse from the sheer weight of it all, I saw the edge of the field ahead of me, the road. The place where I had parked my car. The way out. I sprinted the last few yards, the sound of my footfalls muffled in the dry, cracked earth. The car was just there, so close, but the closer I got, the more I could feel the pressure building. It was like the field itself was fighting against me, pulling me back into its grasp, unwilling to let me leave. I reached my car just in time, just as I heard the unmistakable rustling sound from behind me. The low creak of the scarecrow's limbs, their slow, deliberate movements as they closed in. I threw open the door, jumping into the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys. My hands shook violently as I started the engine, and I didn't wait a second longer before slamming my foot on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the gravel, the road ahead offering no comfort, only the promise of escape. But as I sped away, my heart still racing, a deep dread settled in my stomach. I could still feel them. The scarecrows. They were watching me. And then it happened. Just when I thought I had left the field behind, just when I thought I had outrun them, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. For a brief moment, just as the field disappeared behind me, I saw it. One of the scarecrows had moved. It was standing at the edge of the road, at the spot where the field met the asphalt. Its head was turned toward me, its eyes, hollow and empty, seemed to stare into my soul. But it wasn't the movement that chilled me. It was the thing it was holding, a piece of something. A message. A symbol. I couldn't quite make it out, but it was there, something in the scarecrow's hand. A carved wooden object, twisted and unnatural. It looked almost like an old, withered token, a symbol I didn't recognize. It had the same twisted, jagged shape as the shadows that followed me, the figures that haunted me. I wanted to stop. I wanted to go back, to pull over and confront it, but the terror I felt was too strong. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the world outside a blur as I drove faster, my hands tight on the wheel. But the image of that symbol, the way it seemed to beckon from the darkness, stayed burned into my mind. By the time I had driven far enough to feel like I was out of the field's reach, the car had become an empty shell of safety. My mind raced, filled with the image of that scarecrow's outstretched hand, the symbol it had left behind. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't let go of what I had seen. That thing, that shadow, was still out there, watching, waiting. And now, it had left a mark on me. A symbol, an omen, something that would haunt me long after I was gone from that field. I don't know what it means. But I know this, whatever that symbol was, wherever it came from, it wasn't over. The field, the scarecrows, they weren't finished with me yet. And I couldn't escape them. Not truly. I thought leaving the field behind would bring me peace. I thought I could escape it, them. But peace never came. The further I drove, the farther I put that place behind me, the more I realized that I hadn't truly left. It wasn't just the nightmares. It wasn't just the fear that lingered in my chest, in the back of my mind. It was something deeper. Something that followed me even when I thought I was safe. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, eyes wide. The scarecrows were always there, standing at the edge of my bed, watching me. Their hollow eyes, their twisted forms, always just beyond my reach, always waiting. I tried to tell myself it was just the remnants of fear, a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But it wasn't. It wasn't just a dream. I started to see them during the day. At first, it was just a flash of movement at the edge of my vision, a figure standing still in the distance, too far away to make out clearly. When I looked directly at them, they were gone, nothing but a whisper of shadow, fading into the distance like the memory of a nightmare. I would blink, shake my head, and try to convince myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I would see another. And another. I saw them in the reflection of shop windows as I walked past, their twisted forms standing motionless, their heads turned just slightly toward me. I saw them in the rearview mirror when I drove, standing at the edge of the road, just outside the light of my headlights, waiting. I saw them in the trees when I walked through the forest, their outlines hidden just behind the branches, hidden just enough to make me doubt my eyes. It was the same wherever I went. The scarecrows were there. In the daylight, they were more subtle, more elusive, but no less real. The air around me would grow thick and heavy when they appeared, the silence more suffocating, more oppressive. And always, that feeling, the sense that I wasn't alone. That something was watching, waiting. I couldn't explain it. But I knew it. The field had marked me, and now it followed me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. And the worst part? It wasn't just when I was awake. No. It followed me in my dreams. Every night, without fail, I'd find myself back at that cursed field. The scarecrows would be there, standing motionless, their twisted, silent forms filling the horizon. I would try to run, but my feet would be heavy, like the earth was pulling me down. Every time I looked away, they would move closer. And when I finally did look at them directly, that's when I'd feel the coldest chill, the feeling that they were coming for me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't escape the field, and I couldn't escape what it had left inside me. My grip on reality was slipping, fraying like the edges of an old rope. I tried to ignore it, to go about my days, to act normal, but inside, I was unraveling. My thoughts would drift back to the field, to the scarecrows, to the symbol they had left behind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What did it mean? Why had it stayed with me? Why couldn't I forget it? The world felt like it was changing around me. The familiar places, the roads, the houses, the people, everything began to feel distant, unreal. Like I was living in a dream. But no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew they were still out there. It wasn't just the scarecrows anymore. It was something worse. The shadow. The presence. The thing that had been hunting me. It had followed me from the field. And now, it had taken root in my mind. It wasn't a thing I could see or touch. It was something I could feel, something that had grown inside me, feeding off my fear, my anxiety. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of the scarecrows themselves or the realization that I was slowly losing my mind. That the line between what was real and what wasn't had begun to blur beyond recognition. I wanted to fight it. I wanted to tell myself that I was just imagining things, that it would pass. But deep down, I knew the truth, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The field still had me. And I couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant dread gnawed at me, hollowing me out, a slow and steady erosion of everything I had once known. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. The scarecrows had become more than a nightmare, they had become a part of me. Every moment was overshadowed by them, and the more I tried to escape, the stronger their presence grew. I had to know. I had to understand. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was madness to return, but what choice did I have? How could I keep running from something that followed me even into my dreams? How could I live with this suffocating terror hanging over me, tightening with every passing day? So, I did the only thing I could think of. I went back. The drive was unbearable. Each mile felt longer than the last, the world outside my window passing in a blur of gray and brown, as if the landscape itself had lost its color. The road stretched on endlessly, and the further I drove, the more my stomach twisted in knots. I knew I was heading straight back into the heart of the nightmare, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I pulled up to the edge of the field just as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The same land I had tried to forget. The same land that had claimed a part of me. The scarecrows were there, standing motionless against the fading light, just as they had before. Nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't put into words, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. They were watching me. I parked the car and stepped out, my feet unsteady on the ground, as if the earth itself was resisting me. The field was just as vast, just as empty, just as suffocating. The same silent figures loomed in the distance, their hollow eyes fixed on me. But now, the terror that gripped me wasn't just from their stillness, it was from the knowledge that they weren't still at all. I could feel them shifting, moving, even though I couldn't see it. I could feel them closing in on me, even as I tried to deny it. I took a deep breath, my chest tight, and I forced myself to step forward. Why? I whispered into the wind, though I knew it wasn't meant for anyone but myself. Why are you doing this? The field answered with nothing but the same silence. I moved forward again, my legs heavy, my mind racing. The closer I got to the scarecrows, the harder it became to ignore the crushing pressure in the air. I could hear the faint rustling, the sound of their movements in the distance, just out of sight. They were always out of sight. Always just beyond reach. But this time, I was ready. This time, I would understand. This time, I would find the truth. I reached the first scarecrow and stared at it. Its twisted form stood there, unmoving, its hollow eyes fixed in an eternal gaze. It was as if it were waiting for me to do something, to make a move. But what? What could I possibly do to break this curse? I reached out slowly, my hand trembling as I touched the cold, stiff straw of its body. The texture beneath my fingertips was rough, dry, and brittle. There was nothing about it that seemed alive. But then I felt something. A faint pulse beneath my fingertips, like a heartbeat. A slow, steady thump. I jerked my hand back in shock, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scarecrow. There was something wrong with it, something deeply unnatural. I moved to the next one, then the next, each one more unsettling than the last. I didn't want to touch them. I didn't want to get too close. But my mind, gripped by a need I couldn't understand, kept pushing me forward. Each step felt like I was falling deeper into a nightmare, each scarecrow more oppressive than the last. The air around me was thick, suffocating, as if the field itself was holding me captive. And then, there it was. In the center of the field, standing alone, was something different. A figure, tall and shadowed, draped in something dark. It wasn't like the scarecrows. It was alive. I knew it was alive. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Waiting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. Something in that figure called to me, beckoned me forward, like a magnetic pull. But my feet wouldn't move. The terror that gripped me was too much. I didn't know what to do. But in that moment, I realized it wasn't the scarecrows that had been hunting me all this time. It was this thing, the shadow at the heart of the field. It was the one who had been guiding them. It was the one pulling the strings. And just as the truth began to settle in, I heard it, a whisper, low and indistinct, coming from all around me, from the field itself. You shouldn't have come back. The voice wasn't human. It was wrong. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body was paralyzed, frozen in place. I couldn't escape. Not this time. And I knew, deep down, that I would never escape. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my eyes locked on that shadowed figure at the center of the field. It felt like time had stopped, like the world around me had ceased to exist, leaving only that suffocating silence. But then, something broke the stillness. It started with a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The scarecrows, once stationary, now began to move. Not in a slow, creeping way, but in sharp, deliberate motions, like they were waking from a deep slumber. I saw the first one shift, its limbs jerking unnaturally, the straw that made up its body crackling as if it were brittle wood. It turned its head, its hollow eyes locking onto me, and my blood ran cold. I turned my gaze away, and before I could blink, it had closed the distance between us. I froze. I dared not look back at it, but I knew that it was right there, right beside me. I could feel the weight of its presence, like the air around me had thickened, closing in on my chest. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't move. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. The field was alive. The scarecrows were moving, shifting like predators on the hunt. Every time I turned away, they were closer. Every time I looked back, they were right where I had been. There was no escape. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me, my mind in chaos. The shadowed figure in the center of the field was still there, watching, waiting. But I couldn't focus on it anymore. I couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sense of being pursued. I dared to glance around once more. The scarecrows had moved again, closer this time, more deliberate in their motions, each one more menacing than the last. They weren't just standing anymore. They were coming for me. I could feel their eyes on me even when I wasn't looking, their gaze piercing through the air like needles. The rustling of straw and the sound of limbs shifting in unnatural ways filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. I could hear them, too. Footsteps. Not the soft rustling of straw, but something heavier, more defined. Their feet were pounding the earth, closing in. My breathing became ragged, each inhale a struggle, as if the air had turned to stone. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body betrayed me. It felt like I was moving through thick mud, my legs refusing to obey. Every step forward was a battle, every movement an agonizing attempt to escape. But they were getting closer. I could feel them, just behind me, their presence suffocating, like a noose tightening around my neck. I spun around again, this time desperate to find some kind of refuge, something to shield me from them. But there was nothing. The field stretched out endlessly before me, and the scarecrows were everywhere. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't hide. They were watching from every angle, closing in from all sides. And that figure, the shadow in the center, still stood motionless, but its eyes seemed to glimmer with something dark, something knowing. It was as if it was enjoying this, as if it had orchestrated this entire nightmare. I could feel it now, the pull, the gravitational force of the field itself. The fear. The panic. It was drawing me in, slowly but surely, to the heart of the horror. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I knew was the terror. All I knew was the movement around me, the slow, creeping approach of the scarecrows, their limbs cracking with each step they took. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the earth, desperate, frantic, but the ground felt like it was moving beneath me. Each step felt heavier, harder, as if I were running through thick mud, dragging me down. I glanced behind me, nothing but the endless rows of scarecrows, all of them moving now, shifting in and out of view, but always getting closer, always closing in. I couldn't escape. I ran, my breath ragged, my mind screaming for me to stop, to turn back and face whatever waited. But I couldn't. My body had turned against me. My legs were giving out, my vision blurring. The world around me spun. And then, just as I turned to look over my shoulder one last time, I saw it, one of the scarecrows, its face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural grin. Its body was bent unnaturally, its straw limbs stretched out like claws, reaching for me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling, my body collapsing to the ground, and before I could even make sense of it, it was there. It was right above me. I could feel its presence, looming, suffocating. I was trapped. There was no escape. And as the last bit of my mind gave way to the terror, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't just fear. This was the hunt. And I was the prey. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the earth, my body paralyzed by the overwhelming presence surrounding me. The scarecrows had closed in, their movements faster now, like they had been waiting for this moment. The cold air wrapped around me, a thick, suffocating fog that blurred my vision and turned the world into an indistinct blur of shadows and straw. Then, through the distorted haze of panic, I heard something. A voice. At first, I thought it was the wind, just the rustling of straw in the breeze, but no. This was a voice, low and gravelly, like the crackling of dry leaves in the dead of winter. The words didn't come in a direct line, but in disjointed fragments, as if they were trying to piece together a message through an ancient, forgotten language. Not, escape, can't, run. I blinked, trying to shake the confusion from my mind. The voice was too clear to be a trick of the wind, too real. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, my throat tight, but I couldn't see who was speaking. The scarecrow closest to me was staring at me with its lifeless eyes. Its head tilted slightly, and then, impossibly, its lips parted, its mouth creaking open like the rusted hinges of an old door. "You're already here." The words seemed to reverberate through the air, reverberating in my bones, and I staggered backward, the ground beneath me unsteady. The voice came from the scarecrow itself, from the very thing I had feared. The straw around its mouth shifted, and its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The voice was so deeply unsettling, like a whisper from the past, a warning from something ancient. "Too late, the game begins now." It didn't make sense. The scarecrows didn't talk. This was impossible. I felt the blood drain from my face, the cold terror that had been creeping up my spine suddenly seizing my body, locking it in place. Another voice, or was it the same one, cut through the air again. "You look to run, but you are never free. You are ours." My breath hitched in my chest as the realization struck me. This wasn't just a warning. It was a taunt. These things were playing with me, toying with my fear, knowing exactly how I would react. The more I struggled, the more they could sense it, and the more they would close in. I tried to back away, my legs trembling beneath me. But the more I moved, the closer the scarecrow seemed to get, its lips never ceasing their cryptic words. Each step I took, it mirrored, shifting positions, drawing closer, as if mocking my every attempt to escape. "We are not the ones who hunt," it continued, its voice growing louder, more menacing. "You are." The words were like a strike to my soul, each syllable hitting with the weight of something terrible. It was all true. I had been hunted, and I had been drawn in, step by step. I felt trapped in its gaze, unable to move, unable to escape. The air around me thickened, the pressure in my chest growing tighter, until I thought I might suffocate under it. The scarecrow's arms reached out, its long, skeletal fingers curling toward me with deliberate slowness. It wanted me to see it, wanted me to feel its presence, to realize that it was the one in control now. My body moved without thinking, taking a step back, my heart pounding, but then the voice came again, more insistent, more deliberate. "Look at me." And, against every instinct in my body, I did. My gaze locked onto the scarecrow's hollow eyes, the emptiness staring back at me. It was like I was sinking into those black pits, falling deeper and deeper into its twisted world. "You can't fight it," the scarecrow said, its voice a rasping breath in the stillness of the field. "This is your fate." The words were a weight, pressing on my chest, suffocating me with their meaning. I realized then that there was no escape, no reason, no way to fight back. It was all part of the plan, part of the hunt. And I had already lost. The ground beneath me felt softer, more pliable, as if the earth itself were alive, shifting, closing in around me. I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the scarecrow's words, each one twisting through my mind like a knife. The voice echoed in my head, over and over, repeating the same cruel truth: "You can't escape. You are ours." I turned away, desperate, my breath ragged as I forced myself to move. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud, each step a struggle. But when I looked back, the field was exactly the same as before, those cursed scarecrows standing in their silent vigil, their unmoving forms watching me, their eyes hollow but unblinking. It didn't matter how far I ran, how fast I moved. The feeling of being watched never left me. My mind screamed at me to keep running, but the weight of the air around me kept me tethered to this place, this field, the field of death. I stumbled back toward the road, trying to focus on something, anything, that might bring me a sense of control. The rustle of the wind in the trees, the chirp of distant insects, anything to remind me of the world beyond this nightmare. But every sound, every movement in the corner of my eye reminded me of the scarecrows, of the presence that lingered just out of sight, always waiting for me to falter, always waiting for me to look away. I tried to turn my mind to something rational, it's all in my head, but that didn't hold. It was no longer a matter of sanity, it was a matter of survival. And nothing about this made sense. Nothing about this was real, or at least, it felt like it wasn't. I glanced back once more, and I saw it, the scarecrow closest to the center of the field. It hadn't moved. Or at least, it hadn't while I was looking. But when I turned my gaze away, just for a split second, I saw it shift, just the faintest motion. A rustle of straw. A movement of its limbs that shouldn't have been possible. I froze. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and before I could react, the air around me grew heavy, suffocating. I took a step forward, the urge to leave, to escape, driving me on, but with every step I took, the road ahead seemed to stretch further. The field was always there, pulling me back. The trees on the edge of the field, the ones I passed moments ago, now stood in front of me, blocking the path like sentinels. It was like the whole world had shifted and moved around me in an impossible way. The reality I thought I knew was crumbling, replaced by something darker, something that bent time and space in ways I couldn't comprehend. I started to run again, blindly, desperately, but no matter how fast I moved, I was always back where I started. Every time I looked behind me, the scarecrows were closer. Each glance, each moment of uncertainty, pulled them toward me. I couldn't outrun them, I couldn't outrun this place. This is the curse. A wave of cold washed over me as I stood frozen in place. I had realized it then, the field wasn't just a place. It was a cycle. A trap. Every attempt to escape only brought me back to the center of it, back to the starting point, back to those cursed scarecrows. The scarecrows weren't just waiting, they were part of it, part of this cycle. And I was trapped in it. There is no way out. I fell to my knees, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My mind screamed for an escape, for something, anything that could break the loop, but deep down, I knew. It was futile. I was just another part of this cursed game, a piece on a board where the rules were made by something far older, far more malevolent than I could comprehend. As the scarecrows closed in, their slow, deliberate steps matching the beat of my frantic heart, I realized with a chilling certainty that there was no way to break free. I am part of the field now, and it would never let me leave. The night had fallen silent, an oppressive stillness pressing down on the land. I stood there, alone in the field, the chill of the evening air creeping into my bones. The scarecrows, now closer than ever, were like sentinels in the dark, their twisted, straw-filled forms looming just out of the reach of the fading light. I could feel them, feel their presence as if they were breathing down my neck. Every time I blinked, every time I dared to look away, I felt them inching closer. I wasn't sure how much time had passed since I had last tried to run, since I had tried to escape. The road, the trees, the horizon, they had all become blurred, indistinct. The world no longer made sense. The cycle was endless. I have returned to this place over and over, only to be dragged back each time, as if some invisible hand were pulling me deeper into the trap. The scarecrows weren't just watching me anymore. They were waiting, watching for my next move, for the moment I would falter, for the moment I would show weakness. They knew me now, knew my every thought, my every fear. It didn't matter that I had tried to understand them, tried to fight back. All of it had been meaningless. I felt a sudden, crushing weight in my chest, a realization so stark and final that it threatened to consume me. There was no escape. I had known it for some time, but now it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a place. It wasn't just the scarecrows. It was me. I was bound to this field, tied to it in ways I couldn't comprehend. They had chosen me, and now I was theirs. I tried to summon the last bit of strength left in me, to look away from the field, to step away from the shadows that stretched out before me. But every step felt like an eternity, every breath an impossible feat. My body was moving on instinct now, but it was only a matter of time before the field claimed me completely. And then, I heard it. A rustling sound, far too close to be the wind, far too deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The sound wasn't coming from the scarecrows this time. It was from within the field. From the heart of it, the center of the nightmare. It was a voice, a whisper, soft and low, but unmistakable. "You've always been ours," it said, the voice as cold as the night itself. I turned, my pulse racing, my limbs shaking, but I couldn't find where it had come from. The scarecrows remained still, their wooden frames unmoving in the moonlight, their empty eyes fixed on me. The voice came again, this time louder, more forceful. "You were never meant to leave." And that was when it hit me. The true horror. The truth I had been blind to all along. The field hadn't been trapping me. I hadn't been hunted. I was the scarecrow. The thought shook me to my core. My legs trembled as the realization dawned. The scarecrows had been waiting for me, watching me, because I was one of them all along. The shadowy figures that had once haunted me were merely reflections of something darker, something that had already taken root inside me. I could see it now in the way the straw tangled in my fingers, in the way my body felt heavier, stiffer. I was being transformed. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the world around me spun. The scarecrows hadn't been hunting me. They had been calling me. Every step I had taken, every wrong turn I had made, had been leading me here. To this moment. To this fate. The field had always been my home, my destiny, and now there was no turning back. The curse wasn't something I could break, it had already consumed me. The presence I had felt, the terrifying force I had fought against, had always been within me, growing stronger as I struggled. The field was no longer a place of death. It was my field. And the scarecrows, they were me. As I looked at the others in the field, I knew what I had to do. I would join them. The cycle would continue, and I would become part of the shadows that stalk the living. I would stand still, unmoving, waiting for the next soul to wander into the trap. And I would watch. I would watch with their hollow eyes. Because now, I was one of them. I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, bound to the earth by something stronger than gravity, something deeper than fear. The scarecrows loomed ahead, their crooked forms tall and unmoving in the dim light, but the truth of what I had become was too much to bear. My heart raced, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. The realization had shattered me. I am the scarecrow, but what did that mean? What had I truly become? I took a hesitant step forward, my legs stiff, my vision blurry. Each movement felt forced, like I was watching someone else walk, someone who had no control. But as I stumbled closer to the field center, I felt it, the pull, the gravity of the scarecrows, drawing me in, calling me. The cold air sliced through the field, a windless chill that made my bones ache. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched one of the figures. It was no longer the lifeless, ragged bundle of straw and old clothes I had thought it to be. Beneath the rough exterior, there was something wrong. The straw wasn't just dry and brittle, it was alive, twisting like fingers, moving beneath my touch. The body wasn't just hollow, it was a vessel, filled with something that pulsed, something that breathed. I stepped back, horror creeping up my spine. The scarecrow I had touched twitched, and then its head moved slowly, tilting toward me. Its eyes, hollow, black, and empty, stared into me with a kind of knowing, a kind of hunger that I hadn't felt until now. "You were meant to become one of us," it whispered, the voice not coming from its mouth, but from everywhere around me, inside me. The voice was familiar now. It was mine. I stumbled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to move, to run, but I couldn't escape. The other scarecrows had begun to shift, their forms slowly turning toward me, their movements slow but deliberate. The field around me had transformed. It was no longer a silent witness, no longer a neutral expanse. It was the thing that had called me, that had waited for me. And now it was closing in. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "No, this can't be real. This is just a nightmare. This is..." A low, guttural laugh echoed through the air, so deep and ancient that it shook my soul. I turned, desperate to find this source, but all I could see were the scarecrows, their movements now fluid and unnatural, like predators closing in on prey. It wasn't just the figures that surrounded me now. It was the very land itself. The field had become alive with a terrible awareness, a sentience that stretched across every inch of dirt, every blade of grass. "You were never meant to escape," the voice, my voice, said again, this time clearer, stronger. "We were waiting for you. You were ours. You've always been ours." The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, the earth splitting open in slow, deliberate cracks. I could feel the energy beneath the soil, a dark power rising, pulling at the very fibers of my being. The scarecrows, their eyes now glowing faintly, inched closer, their bodies warping into something more. Their straw arms stretched unnaturally, their limbs growing longer and thinner, their faces twisting into grotesque masks of hunger. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with something that made my chest feel tight, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself watching, helpless, as the scarecrows began to shift and move toward me, each one taking slow, deliberate steps. Their movements were no longer jerky and random, they were smooth, calculated. They were alive. The truth was clear now. The scarecrows were not what they appeared to be. They were not merely mindless guardians of the field. They were something older. Something that thrived on fear, on the energy of the living. They were not here to scare me, they were here to feed on me. To consume me, body and soul, until I was nothing but another part of their twisted creation. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I felt the ground move beneath me, felt it grip me, pull me back toward the center of the field, where the scarecrows waited. "You've been chosen," they said, their voices now layered in a chorus, impossibly deep and hollow, as if 1,000 voices were speaking through them. "You will join us. Forever." I tried to scream again, but the sound was lost, swallowed up by the earth beneath my feet. I realized then, with a final, terrible understanding, that I hadn't been chosen by the field, I had always been a part of it. From the very beginning, the scarecrows were not just watching me, they were watching for me. And now, there would be no escape. I would join them, become part of the field, a part of the darkness that had always been there, waiting. And when the next soul wandered into this cursed place, I would be the one to greet them. I would be the one to watch. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood there, the scarecrows closing in around me. The very ground seemed to hum with an oppressive energy, vibrating with a dark power that seemed to seep into my bones. I could feel it now. This place, the field, had been waiting for me. The scarecrows weren't just mindless figures, they were vessels, conduits for something far older, far more terrifying than I could ever have imagined. But there was one thing I could still control. My anger, my fear, they were all I had left. In a final act of desperation, I reached down and grabbed a large, jagged rock from the earth beneath me. The rock felt heavy in my hand, like a weapon forged from the earth itself, something that might still have the power to break through whatever this thing was. With a guttural cry, I swung the rock at the nearest scarecrow. The force of the strike should have shattered its wooden frame, but instead, the stone bounced off with a hollow thud, like I had hit solid stone. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat, the fear clawing at me. I swung again, harder this time, the rock striking the scarecrow's head with a sickening crack. But it didn't fall. It didn't break. It didn't even flinch. I stepped back, my legs trembling beneath me. The scarecrow didn't move, but its hollow eyes seemed to glow brighter, its straw body shifting unnaturally, as though the force of my strike had only made it stronger. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that shouldn't have been possible for something so still, so lifeless. I knew then, I wasn't just fighting the scarecrow. I was fighting something far more insidious. Something that couldn't be destroyed by force. In a frenzy, I turned to face the others, throwing the rock at them with wild abandon. But they didn't respond the way I expected. They didn't break. They didn't even seem to feel the impact. It was as if they had absorbed the blow, as if the force I used had vanished into them, adding to their power rather than diminishing it. The more I struck them, the more they seemed to grow. Their straw bodies seemed to pulse, like living flesh, twisting and writhing with each futile blow. I dropped the rock, my hands shaking, my breath shallow and erratic. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. They were indestructible. They weren't just objects, they were something far worse, an ancient presence that couldn't be beaten, couldn't be broken. They were eternal. I backed away slowly, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground as the scarecrows advanced. Their movements were deliberate now, each one drawing closer, their heads tilting toward me in a way that seemed almost curious. As if they were studying me, understanding me in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of the truth. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't just a bad dream I could wake up from. This was my reality now, and there was nothing I could do to escape it. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, and the whispers started again. They were louder now, more insistent. The scarecrows had stopped moving, but their presence was suffocating. The field had become a trap, a cage of my own making. No matter how hard I tried to fight, no matter how much I struggled, there was only one certainty now. I was trapped. Forever. The scarecrow's hollow eyes burned into me as they took one last step toward me, their straw hands reaching out, their fingers elongated and twitching with dark anticipation. I realized, in that moment, that my fight had only ever been an illusion. The struggle for survival had been a game to them, a game they knew I could never win. And now, as their hands closed around me, I understood. I had never been meant to escape. I was the prey. Always had been. The field had won. I felt the cold hands of the scarecrows grip me, their straw fingers digging into my flesh as though they were trying to consume me. The field had closed around me, a suffocating trap I could no longer escape. The air was thick with dread, and the whispers were now a deafening cacophony in my ears, a chorus of voices from beyond the grave, each one murmuring its own dark warning, its own mocking farewell. As I struggled, I realized that the more I fought, the stronger their grip became. I could feel the straw seeping into my skin, burrowing into my bones like a slow poison. Every movement, every breath, only seemed to draw me deeper into their embrace. I was no longer just fighting for my life. I was fighting for my soul. And it felt like I was losing. A sudden, jarring realization hit me. These scarecrows, these hollow beings, weren't just physical. They weren't bound to this field. They were a part of something older, something that transcended the physical world. And it wasn't just the field that held the curse. The curse had followed me. The fear I had felt in those early moments, when I first noticed the scarecrows moving in my peripheral vision, when I first heard the whispers in the wind, wasn't the field. It was them. The curse had always been with me. It had been in the way I looked at shadows, in the way I heard things when no one else was around, in the way the world never felt quite real. All of that was part of it, part of the hunger, the ever-present watching. I felt the weight of it now, as the scarecrows pulled me into the center of the field. They were everywhere, surrounding me. Their eyes, no, they weren't eyes, they were hollow pits, locked onto me, unblinking, never relenting. They weren't just observing me anymore. They were becoming a part of me. Their presence was sinking into my very soul. I heard their voices again, clearer now. No longer whispers, but taunts, accusations. They spoke to me in unison, their voices growing louder, converging, as if the scarecrows themselves were communicating with me on some deeper level, a language I didn't want to understand but had no choice but to hear. You thought you could escape. You thought you could outrun us. You thought this was just a field. Their hands tightened around me, and the feeling of their straw claws sinking deeper into my skin was unbearable. I could feel them, not just in my body, but in my mind, worming their way into my thoughts, my memories, pulling at the very core of who I was. In that final moment, as the darkness closed in, I understood. It wasn't just the field that had been cursed. It was me. The scarecrows had never truly been after my body. They had been after my spirit, my essence, waiting for the moment when I would finally see the truth that the curse had been planted in me long ago. Now, it was no longer just the field that I feared. It was myself. The scarecrow's laughter echoed in my mind, the sound of their voices merging into one chilling word. Forever. And I understood, with a cold, sinking clarity. There was no escape. The curse was inside me now, and I would carry it with me for as long as I lived, or perhaps even beyond. The field was just the beginning. The true horror was that this curse would never let go, no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I fought. And so, as the darkness enveloped me, I realized the truth. It wasn't just the scarecrows that had won. It was the curse itself, an endless, unbreakable cycle that would haunt me, just as it had haunted the field. And the worst part? The curse would never let me forget. It had already begun. The world around me felt like a distant memory, fading and slipping through my fingers like sand. My body was no longer my own, my limbs heavy and unresponsive, but my mind was wide awake, tormented. The scarecrows, once mere figures in a field, now hovered in the corners of my vision, in the shadows of every room, every street, every waking moment. I didn't die in the field. No, the curse was far more insidious than that. I was left alive, but the horror that had consumed me there had never really ended. The scarecrows had always been more than just physical entities. They had become a part of me, part of my mind, buried deep within the darkest corners of my thoughts. As I stumbled away from the field, disoriented and numb, I thought I could leave it all behind. The field, the scarecrows, the whispers. But they followed me, not through the air or the land, but inside me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Every place I went, every person I saw, was now tainted by their presence. They were in my mind, their hollow eyes staring at me from the back of my eyelids, their whispers a constant buzz in my ears, always just beyond my reach. I tried to forget. I tried to live a normal life, to bury the memories of that cursed place. But there was no forgetting the field. The more I fought to push them away, the stronger they grew. At night, I would wake in a cold sweat, the scent of straw and earth thick in my lungs, the figures standing at the edge of my bed, watching me with their unmoving, hollow eyes. I couldn't escape them. Not in sleep, not in wakefulness, not in life. The scarecrows had become the ghosts of my own mind. They had woven themselves into my soul, their presence a constant weight on my chest. The real world had become a blur, a faded backdrop to the nightmare that I now lived in perpetuity. I tried to speak to people, tried to explain what had happened, but they never understood. How could they? They couldn't see the figures in the corners of the room, couldn't hear the whispers that echoed in my head, couldn't feel the cold, gnarled fingers that reached out to touch them even when they weren't there. No one could see what I saw. No one could hear what I heard. The worst part was that the scarecrows didn't need the field anymore. They had no need to move or to stalk me in the physical world. They had become part of me, their power now woven into the very fabric of my thoughts, my fears, my psyche. Every time I thought I was free, they would remind me. With a shadow out of place, a whisper in the wind, a flicker of movement just outside the edge of my vision. The moment I looked away, they were there. Always. I tried everything to rid myself of them. Therapy, medication, isolation, nothing worked. The scarecrows were with me now, and they would always be with me. There was no escaping them. They had won. Not in the way I thought they would, not with death or destruction, but in a far more cruel, unrelenting way. I was alive, but I was broken. And as I sat in the silence of my room, the scarecrow's presence was more suffocating than ever. They had taken my mind, my reality, and in the end, they had left me with nothing but the knowledge that I would never be free. Their eyes burned into me from every corner. Their whispers were louder now, clearer. They were always there. Forever. And I realized, in the end, it wasn't just the field that was cursed. It was me. Always me. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.